Every restless mind you carry through the day begins to speak louder when the night finally comes. When everything slows down, when the world stops asking for your attention, when there is nothing left to distract you, that is when the thoughts return. The ones you tried to outrun, the ones you pushed aside, the ones that wait patiently in silence, only to rise when you are alone. Not because something is wrong with you, but because no one ever showed you how to sit in peace with your own mind. You were taught how to solve problems, but not how to stop creating them in your head. Taught how to prepare for tomorrow, but never how to rest today. So the mind keeps moving. It replays, it predicts, it questions, it searches. And before you realize it, a quiet night becomes a battlefield of thoughts you cannot turn off. But there is another way to exist within your own mind. A quieter way, a steadier way, one that does not depend on controlling every thought, but on understanding them. The Stoics understood something most people miss, that overthinking is not a sign of intelligence, but a sign of unrest, and that peace begins the moment you stop chasing every thought that appears. Tonight is not about forcing silence, it is about allowing it, not about fighting your mind, but learning how to step back from it, not about solving everything, but realizing that not everything needs to be solved. This is your space to slow down, to release the mental weight you have been carrying for too long, to let the noise settle without resistance, and to rediscover what it feels like when your mind is not pulling you in 1,000 directions at once. For the next 3 hours, you are not here to think more. You are here to finally rest. And as the mind begins to slow, something unusual starts to happen. The thoughts that once felt urgent begin to reveal their true nature, not as enemies, but as unfinished echoes asking for space to dissolve. This is where most people make a quiet mistake. They interrupt their own mind. They rush to fix, distract, or escape what is already fading on its own. But tonight, you begin differently. There is a subtle discomfort that comes when a thought starts to unfold. It carries a feeling with it, a tension, a sense that something needs to be done about it. And almost instantly, the mind reacts. It tries to shut it down. It jumps to another thought. It searches for relief. But what if that reaction is what keeps the cycle alive? A thought, when left alone, has a natural lifespan. It rises, it moves, and it fades, just like a wave that builds and returns to still water. But when you interfere, when you try to stop it too early or push it away, you give it more energy. You turn a passing moment into a lingering presence. The discipline here is quiet, but powerful. It is the ability to let a thought complete itself without stepping in, not to agree with it, not to fight it, just to let it move from beginning to end without resistance. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The mind is not used to this kind of patience. It has been trained to react quickly, to solve, to control. So when you stop interfering, it may feel like you are losing control. But what is really happening is the opposite. You are no longer feeding the cycle. When a thought arises, notice the urge to interrupt it, the urge to distract yourself, the urge to replace it with something else. Instead of following that urge, stay with the thought as it is. Let it unfold. Let it say everything it wants to say. And then watch what happens when you do nothing. You begin to see that most thoughts are incomplete, not because they are important, but because they were never allowed to finish. They were cut short, pushed aside, or tangled with other thoughts. And so they return again and again, not for meaning, but for closure. This is why overthinking feels endless. It is not that there are too many thoughts. It is that too many of them were interrupted, left open, unfinished. There is a kind of mental respect in allowing a thought to pass fully. You are not treating it as something dangerous. You are not giving it authority. You are simply allowing it to exist for a moment without interference. And in that allowance, it loses its urgency. Sometimes the thought will carry emotion, a memory, a regret, a question that has no clear answer. The instinct will be to escape it. But when you stay, when you let it move without interruption, something shifts. The emotion softens. The intensity fades. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting it. This is not about analyzing the thought. It is not about understanding it deeply. It is about giving it space to complete its natural course, like watching a cloud pass across the sky without trying to change its shape. You may notice that when you allow this, the next thought comes more gently, and then the next. The mind begins to slow down, not because you controlled it, but because you stopped feeding its need to rush. There is a quiet confidence that builds here, the understanding that not every thought needs your attention, that you can sit with what arises without being pulled into it, and that the mind, when not interrupted, knows how to settle itself. Over time, this becomes easier. The urge to interfere becomes weaker. The space between thoughts becomes wider. And what once felt like noise begins to feel like distance. This is where silence begins, not as something you force, but as something that appears when the mind is no longer being pushed in every direction. So when the next thought comes, let it come fully. Let it speak without cutting it off. Let it rise and fall on its own. And trust that it will end, just as all things do, when you no longer stand in its way. And in that simple act of allowing, you begin to experience something rare. A mind that is not at war with itself. A mind that is learning, slowly and steadily, how to rest. And as the mind begins to understand that it does not need to interrupt every thought, another pattern slowly comes into view. A quieter habit, but far more exhausting. One that does not just pass through the mind, but stays, repeats, and tightens its grip over time. There is a kind of conversation that never truly ends. It replays itself in different ways, with different words, but always with the same tension underneath. A sentence you wish you said differently. A moment that keeps returning. A response you keep rewriting, even though the moment has already passed. It feels productive at first, as if the mind is preparing, correcting, improving. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. The brain begins to treat these imagined conversations as real events. The emotions they carry start to feel present, even though nothing is happening around you. This is where the weight builds, not from reality, but from repetition. Every time the mind replays a moment, it strengthens the emotional imprint attached to it. The frustration becomes sharper, the regret becomes heavier, the tension becomes more familiar. And slowly, without noticing, the mind begins to live more in these rehearsed scenarios than in what is actually happening. The problem is not the thought itself, it is the return, the constant revisiting, the quiet habit of going back again and again, as if something new will be found, when in truth, the mind is only deepening the same path. There is a reason this feels difficult to stop. The brain is wired to learn through repetition. It believes that by replaying something, it is gaining control over it. But in this case, it is doing the opposite. It is reinforcing the loop, making the thought easier to return to and harder to leave behind. This is why a single conversation can follow you for hours, sometimes even days, not because it was that important, but because it was rehearsed so many times that it became familiar. And the mind tends to return to what is familiar, even when it causes discomfort. You may notice how quickly the body reacts during these moments. The tension in the chest, the tightening in the jaw, the subtle shift in breathing, all of it happening in response to something that is not actually occurring. The body does not know the difference between what is real and what is being replayed. It only responds to what the mind presents. This is the hidden cost. Not just mental exhaustion, but physical strain. A quiet drain of energy that builds over time. Breaking this pattern does not come from forcing the mind to stop. That only creates more resistance. Instead, it begins with noticing when the replay starts. The moment the mind returns to the same scene, the same words, the same imagined outcome. There is a difference between remembering and rehearsing. Remembering is brief. It passes through. Rehearsing lingers. It repeats. It tries to reshape something that is already finished. When you notice the repetition, do not push it away, but also do not follow it deeper. Let it appear just as you learned before, but this time recognize that it does not need to be continued. It has already completed its path in reality. What remains is only the echo. You are not required to respond to that echo. There is a quiet strength in allowing a thought to exist without adding to it, not building on it, not correcting it, not expanding it into something larger, just letting it be what it is, without feeding it more attention than it needs. At first, the mind may resist this. It may try to pull you back into the conversation, to convince you that there is something important left to solve. But if you stay still, if you do not engage, the pull begins to weaken. The replay loses its momentum, and in that moment, something becomes clear. The mind was not seeking resolution. It was seeking repetition. And once that repetition is no longer given energy, the cycle begins to break. This is not about forgetting what happened. It is about no longer reliving it. The past does not need to be rehearsed to be understood. It does not need to be repeated to be accepted. It only needs to be seen once, clearly, and then allowed to rest. As this becomes a habit, the space in your mind begins to change. There is less noise, less tension, fewer loops pulling you back, and more moments where nothing is being replayed at all. This is where peace starts to grow, not from controlling every thought, but from refusing to keep reliving the same ones. And as you continue, the mind begins to trust this stillness. It learns that it does not need to return to every moment, that it can move forward without carrying every conversation with it. And in that quiet shift, something lightens. The weight you have been carrying begins to fade, not because it was forced away, but because it was finally allowed to end. And as those repeated conversations begin to lose their hold, another pattern quietly reveals itself. One that feels even more real, even more intense. Not just replaying what happened, but continuing it, building on it, arguing inside your own mind as if the other person were still standing in front of you. There is a certain tension that rises when the mind starts defending itself. Words begin to form, explanations, comebacks, justifications. It feels like you are finally saying what needed to be said, finally winning the argument, finally proving your point. But look closely. No one is there. The body reacts as if it is real. The emotions rise. The heart speeds up. The jaw tightens. All for a conversation that is not happening. And yet, it feels urgent, almost necessary, as if you must complete it in order to feel at peace. This is where the mind becomes trapped in a loop of invisible conflict. It is not just remembering what was said, it is continuing the fight, creating both sides of the argument, playing the role of yourself and the other person, anticipating their response, then reacting to it again, over and over, without end. The mind believes it is resolving something, but in truth, it is extending the tension. Every internal argument keeps the emotion alive. It gives it new words, new fuel, new life. What could have faded quietly becomes louder, sharper, more defined. And slowly, the mind begins to carry battles that no longer exist. There is a quiet realization that changes everything. You are not required to attend every argument your mind invites you to. Just because a thought appears does not mean it deserves a response. Just because a voice forms in your head does not mean you need to answer it. This is where the power begins, not in winning the argument, but in refusing to enter it. At first, this feels unnatural. The mind is used to defending itself, to explaining, to proving. It has been trained to react, to correct, to protect its image. So when you step back, when you choose not to engage, it may feel like you are losing. But what are you losing, really? There is no victory in arguing with something that is not present. There is no resolution in debating a version of someone that exists only in your thoughts. The only thing being strengthened is the habit itself. When the internal argument begins, notice the pull, the urge to respond, the desire to correct what was said, even if it happened hours or days ago. Instead of following that urge, pause. Let the thought speak without answering it. It may continue for a moment. It may try to draw you in again. But if you remain still, if you do not engage, something unexpected happens. The argument loses structure. Without your participation, it cannot continue in the same way. It begins to fade. This is not suppression. You are not pushing the thought away. You are simply not feeding it. You are allowing it to exist without giving it the attention it needs to grow. There is a deep kind of peace in this, a quiet strength in not needing to prove anything in your own mind, in not needing to defend yourself against a voice that is not real. Over time, the mind begins to change. The arguments become shorter, less frequent, less convincing. The need to respond weakens, and the space between thoughts grows wider. You begin to see that most of these internal debates were never about resolution. They were about control. The mind trying to rewrite what cannot be changed, trying to secure an outcome that has already passed. But peace does not come from controlling every version of the past. It comes from stepping out of it. There is nothing left to prove here, nothing left to win. When you stop arguing internally, something else becomes possible. A kind of silence that is not forced, but natural. A stillness that comes from no longer being pulled into endless mental conflict. And in that stillness, you return to the present, not carrying conversations that no longer exist, not defending yourself against imagined voices, just being here, without tension, without resistance. This is where the mind begins to rest, not because it has solved everything, but because it has stopped fighting what is no longer there. And as you continue, that rest becomes familiar. The absence of argument becomes normal, and the peace you once searched for in answers begins to appear in silence. And as the need to argue begins to fade, something deeper starts to surface. A quieter discomfort, not loud like conflict, but persistent in a different way. It comes in the form of questions, loose ends, things that never fully made sense. There is a subtle tension in not knowing, a feeling that something is incomplete, that something needs to be figured out before you can finally relax. And so the mind begins to search. It goes over details. It tries to connect pieces. It looks for meaning where there may be none. This is where overthinking often disguises itself as problem-solving. It feels responsible. It feels necessary, as if clarity is just one more thought away. But the more you chase it, the further it seems to move. The mind keeps circling the same questions, not because they can be answered, but because they were never meant to be resolved in that way. There are questions that do not have clean endings, conversations that never reached closure, situations that ended without explanation, and the mind, uncomfortable with that openness, tries to close the loop by force. But not every loop needs to be closed. There is a kind of peace that only appears when you stop demanding answers. Not because the answers are unimportant, but because your peace should not depend on them. When the mind believes it must understand everything before it can rest, it creates a condition that can never be fully satisfied. Because life does not always explain itself. The Stoics understood this well. They knew that uncertainty is not something to eliminate, but something to live with. That control is limited. That clarity is not always immediate. And that chasing certainty often leads to more confusion, not less. The discipline here is not in finding answers, but in allowing questions to exist without urgency. When a question appears, notice the pressure it brings, the sense that it must be resolved, that you cannot move forward without understanding it completely. Instead of following that pressure, pause. Let the question remain open. You are not ignoring it. You are not avoiding it. You are simply not forcing it to close before its time. There is a difference between thoughtful reflection and restless searching. One is calm. The other is driven by discomfort. Most overthinking comes from trying to escape that discomfort. But what if the discomfort itself is not something to escape? When you sit with an unanswered question without chasing it, something shifts. The tension begins to loosen. The urgency fades. The mind realizes that it does not need immediate resolution to be at ease. At first, this may feel unfamiliar. The mind is used to filling in gaps, to completing patterns, to creating conclusions. So when you leave something open, it may return to it again. It may try to pull you back into the search. But each time you choose not to follow, the pull becomes weaker. There is a quiet strength in saying, even without words, that not everything needs to be understood right now. That some things can remain unfinished without disturbing your peace. And over time, you begin to notice something important. Many of the questions that once felt heavy begin to lose their weight. Not because they were answered, but because they were no longer being chased. They simply fade into the background. This is not about becoming indifferent. It is about becoming steady. About not letting every unknown create tension inside you. About trusting that clarity, when needed, will come in its own time, not through force. There is also a deeper truth here. Some answers do not come from thinking more. They come from stepping back, from giving space, from allowing life to unfold, instead of trying to predict or control every outcome. When you stop chasing closure, you make room for understanding to arrive naturally. The mind becomes quieter, less urgent, less demanding. It no longer feels the need to resolve everything before resting. And in that shift, a new kind of freedom appears. You are no longer tied to every question. You can move through the day without carrying the weight of things you do not yet understand. You can sit in silence without needing to fill it with answers. You can rest, even with uncertainty present. And that is where peace deepens. Not in having everything figured out, but in being at ease without needing to. As this becomes part of you, overthinking begins to lose one of its strongest roots. The need for closure weakens. The pressure to solve everything softens. And the mind, no longer chasing what cannot be forced, begins to settle into something more stable. A quiet acceptance, a steady calm, a space where questions can exist without disturbing your rest. And as the mind slowly learns to sit with what it does not understand, another layer begins to reveal itself. A quieter pressure, but one that feels immediate. A sense that something must be done right now, that a thought cannot wait, that it demands attention, action, resolution. There is a certain tension that appears without warning. It does not always come with clear words. Sometimes it is just a feeling, a tightness, a subtle push inside the mind that says, "Handle this now." And before you realize it, the mind begins to move faster, searching, planning, reacting. It feels important. It feels necessary. But look closely. Nothing is actually happening. This is where the illusion begins. The mind is very skilled at creating urgency. It takes a simple thought and gives it weight. It presents it as something that cannot be ignored, as if delaying it would lead to consequences. And so you respond. Not because the situation requires it, but because the feeling inside you demands it. This is how overthinking gains its momentum. It convinces you that every thought is time-sensitive, that every idea needs to be followed immediately, that every concern must be addressed before you can rest. And so the mind stays active, not because there is real urgency, but because it has been trained to react to the feeling of urgency itself. There is a difference between a real situation and a mental one. A real situation requires action. It is present. It is happening in front of you. A mental one exists only in thought. It feels real, but it does not require immediate response. The problem is that the body reacts the same way to both. When the mind creates urgency, the body follows. The heart rate shifts, the breath changes, the muscles tighten slightly. All signals that something needs attention. But if you pause and look around, there is no actual event taking place, only a thought asking to be taken seriously. This is where awareness changes everything. When a thought appears with urgency, do not follow it immediately. Instead, pause. Notice the feeling it brings, the push to act, the sense that it cannot wait. And then ask yourself quietly, without tension, does this need to be handled right now? Most of the time the answer is no, but the mind will not accept that easily. It may insist. It may bring the thought back stronger. It may try to convince you that ignoring it is irresponsible. But what it is really doing is trying to maintain its pattern, the pattern of reacting. Breaking this pattern does not require force. It requires patience, the willingness to let a thought sit without responding to it immediately, to allow the feeling of urgency to exist without turning it into action. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to movement, to solving, to staying ahead. So when you choose stillness instead, it may interpret that as delay, as avoidance. But what you are actually doing is separating feeling from necessity. Not everything that feels urgent is important, and not everything that is important needs to be handled in the moment it appears. There is a calm strength in being able to wait, to not be pulled by every signal the mind creates, to choose when to respond instead of reacting automatically. As you practice this, something begins to shift. The urgency starts to lose its intensity. The thoughts that once demanded attention begin to feel lighter, less convincing, less immediate. You begin to see that urgency was never in the thought itself. It was in the way it was presented. And once you stop accepting that presentation without question, the mind begins to slow down. There is more space between thoughts, more time before reacting, more awareness of what actually needs your attention and what does not. This is where clarity begins to grow. You are no longer pulled in every direction by the mind's signals. You are able to see them for what they are: temporary, passing, not always relevant to the present moment. And in that clarity, something quiet and steady takes its place. A sense that you do not need to rush internally, that your mind does not need to be in constant motion to be in control, that you can sit even when a thought feels urgent and trust that nothing is being lost by not reacting immediately. This is where overthinking begins to lose its speed. Not because the thoughts disappear, but because they no longer control your pace. And as that pace slows, the mind begins to settle into something deeper. A rhythm that is not driven by pressure, but by awareness. A space where not every thought becomes an emergency. A space where you can finally rest without feeling like something is waiting to be solved. And as the urgency begins to lose its grip, something even more subtle starts to become visible. Not the thoughts themselves, but the way you relate to them. The quiet habit of treating every thought as if it were you. There is a voice that speaks constantly in the background. It comments, it judges, it remembers, it predicts. And for most of your life, it has felt like that voice is who you are. Not something you hear, but something you are. But what if that is not true? There is a small distance that can be noticed if you look closely. A gap between the thought and the one who is aware of it. It is easy to miss because the mind moves quickly, but it is always there. You can hear a thought, which means you are not the thought itself. At first, this feels unfamiliar. The mind is used to identifying with everything it produces. Every opinion feels personal. Every memory feels attached. Every judgment feels like a reflection of who you are. But when you begin to observe, instead of immediately agreeing, something changes. The thought becomes something you notice, not something you become. There is a kind of relief in this separation, a quiet space that opens up when you realize that not every thought needs to define you, that a passing idea does not carry authority unless you give it that authority. When a thought says something negative, it often feels like truth, not because it is accurate, but because it was accepted without question. The mind presents it, and instantly it is believed. But if you step back, even slightly, you begin to see it differently. You begin to hear the thought as a voice, not as a fact. This is where awareness becomes important, not as something you create, but something you return to. The simple act of noticing, of seeing the thought appear without immediately stepping inside it. You do not need to argue with the thought. You do not need to replace it. You do not need to fix it. Just see it. There is a powerful shift when you move from "this is me" to "this is something I am observing." The thought loses its weight. It may still appear, it may still carry emotion, but it no longer feels like something you must follow. It becomes a passing sound rather than a command. This does not mean the voice disappears. It will continue to speak. That is what the mind does. But your relationship with it begins to change. Instead of being pulled into every sentence, you remain where you are, watching, listening, without attachment. At first, the mind may resist this distance. It may try to pull you back into identification. It may make the thoughts feel more urgent, more personal. But if you stay with the observation, if you continue to notice without reacting, the pull begins to weaken. You begin to see patterns, repeated phrases, familiar worries, the same ideas returning in different forms, and once you see them clearly, they begin to lose their influence.
Because they are no longer hidden inside you.
They are visible. There is a quiet freedom in realizing that you are not required to believe everything you think, that the voice inside your head is not always accurate, not always helpful, not always necessary, and more importantly, not always you. There is something deeper than that voice, a steady presence that remains even when the thoughts change. It does not rush, it does not argue, it simply observes. That presence is where calm begins. When you rest there, even briefly, the mind becomes quieter, not because the thoughts stop, but because they are no longer being followed so closely. They pass by without leaving the same mark. You may notice moments where there is nothing to say, no commentary, just a quiet awareness of being here, breathing, existing, without needing to think about it. Those moments are not empty, they are clear, and as you return to them more often, the space between you and the voice grows, not as separation, but as understanding, a recognition that you can hear the mind without becoming it. This is where overthinking begins to lose its control, because overthinking depends on identification, on you believing every thought is part of you. Once that belief softens, the thoughts no longer have the same hold. They come, they go, and you remain, not caught inside them, but aware of them. And in that awareness, something steady begins to take root. A calm that does not depend on silence, but on distance. A quiet knowing that you are not the noise in your head, but the space in which it appears. And from that space, the mind finally begins to rest. And as that distance between you and your thoughts becomes clearer, another quiet habit begins to reveal itself. One that has been there for a long time, almost unnoticed. The constant urge to fix, to adjust, to correct every thought, every feeling, every situation the moment it appears. There is a subtle pressure in the mind that says something is always incomplete, that something needs to be improved, resolved, or made better before you can relax. And so, the mind keeps working. Even when there is nothing happening around you, it searches for problems to solve. At first, this feels responsible. It feels like you are staying in control, like you are preparing, improving, staying ahead. But over time, it becomes exhausting, because the mind never reaches a point where everything is finally fixed. There is always something else. A detail to revisit, a decision to rethink, a situation to adjust in your head. And so the cycle continues, not because everything is broken, but because the mind has developed the habit of treating everything as if it is. This is where overthinking quietly grows, not from real problems, but from the belief that everything needs to be handled immediately. But not everything needs to be fixed. There are moments that do not require solutions, feelings that do not need to be analyzed, thoughts that do not need to be corrected, and situations that simply need time, not intervention. The difficulty is that the mind is not comfortable with leaving things as they are. It wants movement. It wants resolution. It wants to feel like it is doing something. So when you choose not to fix, it may feel like you are neglecting something important, like you are falling behind. But what you are actually doing is allowing space. There is a difference between solving and overworking the mind. Solving is clear. It happens when something truly requires attention. It is direct, focused, and usually short. Overworking is repetitive. It circles the same point. It tries to improve something that does not need improvement in that moment. You can begin to notice this difference. When a real problem appears, it feels grounded. It is connected to the present. It has a clear path. But when the mind is trying to fix something unnecessarily, it feels restless. It jumps. It repeats. It does not arrive anywhere. That is the sign. When you notice that restlessness, instead of following it, pause. Let the thought exist without trying to adjust it, without trying to make it better. Just allow it to be exactly as it is. This may feel uncomfortable at first. The mind is used to stepping in, to controlling the direction. So when you step back, it may try to pull you in again. It may present the same thought in a different way, hoping you will engage. But if you remain still, if you do not take the role of fixing, something begins to shift. The thought loses its urgency. Without your effort, it begins to settle on its own, not because it was solved, but because it did not need to be solved in the first place. There is a quiet strength in allowing things to remain imperfect for a moment, in not rushing to correct every detail, in trusting that not everything requires your immediate involvement. This does not mean you ignore real responsibilities. It means you stop creating unnecessary ones in your mind. You begin to save your energy for what truly matters. As this becomes a habit, the mind starts to feel lighter. There is less pressure to constantly improve everything, less need to control every outcome, more space between thoughts. And in that space, something calm begins to grow. You realize that peace is not found in fixing everything. It is found in knowing when not to fix. When you stop trying to solve every thought, the mind begins to slow down. The constant movement fades. The tension softens. And for the first time in a long while, you are not carrying the responsibility of managing everything inside your head. You are simply here, allowing things to be as they are. And in that allowance, the mind finds something it has been searching for all along. Not perfection, not control, but rest. And as the pressure to fix everything begins to soften, a deeper layer quietly comes into focus. Not just the need to solve, but the need to control, to arrange things in your mind before they happen, to prepare every outcome, every response, every possibility, as if doing so could protect you from uncertainty. There is a certain comfort in planning ahead. The mind feels safer when it believes it has already mapped out what is coming. It builds scenarios. It rehearses outcomes. It tries to stay one step ahead of life. And for a moment, it feels like control. But look closely. Nothing has actually happened. This is where the habit becomes subtle. It hides behind responsibility. It tells you that you are being prepared, that you are thinking ahead, that you are avoiding mistakes. But in reality, the mind is trying to manage something that does not yet exist. And in doing so, it never rests. There is always another outcome to consider, another version of the future to organize, another situation to prepare for. And because the future is endless, the mind stays busy without ever reaching completion. This is not preparation. This is attachment to control.
The belief that if you think enough, plan enough, organize enough, you can shape what is coming. But life does not move according to mental rehearsals. It unfolds on its own terms, in its own timing.
And the more you try to control it from your mind, the more tension you create inside yourself. There is a quiet fear underneath this habit, a fear of being unprepared, of being caught off guard, of not knowing what to do when the moment arrives. And so the mind tries to eliminate that fear by staying ahead.
But the truth is, you cannot live in the future and be at peace in the present at the same time.
One will always disturb the other. Breaking this habit does not mean you stop planning when it is necessary. It means you stop planning what does not require your attention right now. It means you stop organizing moments that have not arrived. When a thought about the future appears, notice how quickly the mind begins to build around it. It creates possibilities. It tries to predict reactions. It fills in details that do not exist yet. Instead of following that movement, pause. Let the thought remain simple. You do not need to expand it. You do not need to complete it. You do not need to turn it into a full scenario. Just let it be a thought, and nothing more. At first, this may feel like you are leaving something unfinished, like you are missing an opportunity to prepare. But what you are actually doing is returning your attention to what is real. Right now, there is nothing to control. And that realization, if you stay with it, brings a quiet sense of relief. The mind begins to understand that it does not need to manage everything in advance, that it can meet situations when they arrive instead of trying to live them ahead of time. There is a deeper kind of confidence that grows from this. Not the confidence of having everything planned, but the confidence of knowing you can respond when needed. You begin to trust your ability to handle the moment without rehearsing it. And that trust changes the way the mind behaves. It becomes less urgent, less controlling, less driven to organize every outcome. There is more space, more stillness, more presence.
You are no longer trying to control life before it happens.
You are allowing it to unfold and meeting it as it comes. This is where the mind begins to rest more deeply, because it is no longer carrying the weight of the future. It is no longer trying to manage what cannot be managed. It is simply here, breathing, observing, waiting without tension. And in that space, something steady begins to take shape, a calm that does not depend on certainty, a quiet strength that does not come from control, but from letting go of the need for it. And as that need fades, the mind becomes lighter, less crowded, less restless, no longer trying to organize every outcome, but finally learning how to exist without needing to. And as the need to control begins to loosen, something even more freeing starts to appear. A quiet option that was always there, but rarely used. The choice to not participate, to let a thought pass without stepping into it. There is a moment, small and almost invisible, when a thought first appears. It has not yet grown. It has not yet pulled you in. It is simply there, waiting. And in that moment, there is a choice. Most of the time, the choice happens so quickly that it goes unnoticed. The mind sees the thought and immediately enters it. It follows it, builds on it, reacts to it. And before you realize it, you are no longer observing the thought. You are inside it. But what if you stayed outside? There is a kind of calm that does not come from stopping thoughts, but from not engaging with them. A calm that grows when you stop treating every thought as something that needs your involvement. Not every thought is a message. Not every idea is important. Not every mental image needs to be followed. Some thoughts are simply passing noise. The difficulty is that the mind has been trained to respond to everything. It feels responsible for managing each thought, as if ignoring one would lead to something being missed. But in reality, most thoughts do not require your attention at all. They only feel important because you step into them. When you begin to practice non-participation, the first thing you notice is the urge to engage. A thought appears, and almost immediately there is a pull to follow it, to respond, to react, to continue the story. Instead of following that pull, pause.
Let the thought be there, without stepping inside it.
You do not need to push it away. You do not need to replace it. Just do not engage. At first, this feels unusual. The mind may try to draw you back in. It may repeat the thought. It may make it feel more urgent, more emotional, more personal. But if you stay still, if you do not participate, something begins to happen. The thought loses its movement. Without your attention, it cannot grow in the same way. It has nothing to build on, no reaction to expand from. And so, it begins to fade. This is where a different kind of silence starts to form. Not the silence of having no thoughts, but the silence of not being involved in them. A quiet distance where thoughts can pass without leaving a trace. You begin to notice that you can sit with many thoughts passing through your mind without being affected by them, like watching people walk by without needing to follow each one. There is a lightness in this. You are no longer carrying every thought, no longer reacting to every idea, no longer turning every mental movement into something personal. You are simply aware. And in that awareness, there is calm. This calm is not forced. It does not require effort. It appears naturally when you stop participating in what does not need your energy. You may notice moments where thoughts come and go quickly without pulling you in. Moments where the mind feels open, spacious, quiet. Not because it is empty, but because you are no longer filling it with reactions. This is where overthinking begins to fade more noticeably. Because overthinking depends on participation. It needs your attention, your reaction, your involvement. Without that, it cannot continue in the same way. The thoughts may still appear, but they do not stay. And as this becomes more familiar, the mind begins to trust this state. It stops trying to engage with everything. It becomes more selective, more still. There is a deeper sense of control here, but it does not feel like control. It feels like freedom. Freedom from having to respond to every thought. Freedom from being pulled into every mental direction. Freedom from carrying things that were never meant to stay. And in that freedom, the mind begins to rest more fully. You are no longer managing every thought. You are no longer reacting to every signal. You are simply present, allowing things to pass without interference. And that presence becomes steady. A quiet space where the mind is no longer crowded with engagement, but open with awareness. A place where calm is not something you chase, but something that remains when you choose not to participate. And as you begin to step back from thoughts instead of entering them, something else becomes clearer. A pattern that once felt confusing now starts to make sense. The same thoughts returning, the same memories resurfacing, the same feelings repeating, even when nothing new has happened. There is a quiet question underneath it all. Why does the mind keep bringing back what hurts? It can feel like something is wrong, like the repetition means the thought is important, that it must be solved, understood, or fixed before it can finally stop. But the truth is more subtle than that. The mind is not repeating pain to punish you. It is repeating it to protect you. There is a part of the brain that is always scanning for danger. It stores past experiences, especially the ones that carried strong emotion, and keeps them close. Not because they matter more than anything else, but because they once signaled a threat. So the mind brings them back, again and again, not to keep you stuck, but to make sure you do not forget. This is where the confusion begins, because the mind does not always know the difference between past and present. When it recalls something painful, the body responds as if it is happening now. The feeling returns, the tension builds, and it creates the illusion that something is still unresolved. But what is actually happening is repetition without necessity. The event has passed. The situation is no longer present. But the mind, still trying to protect you, replays it as a reminder. It is not a signal of importance. It is a signal of memory. When you begin to see this clearly, the relationship with those thoughts starts to change. Instead of reacting to them as urgent or meaningful, you begin to recognize them as familiar patterns, old echoes, not current threats. This does not mean the memory disappears. It may still come. It may still carry emotion, but it no longer holds the same authority. You are no longer asking, "Why is this happening again?" with tension. You begin to understand quietly, this is just the mind repeating what it once believed was important. And in that understanding, the intensity softens. There is also a deeper layer here. The more you react to these repeated thoughts, the more the mind learns that they are important. It takes your reaction as confirmation. So it brings them back again, trying to keep you safe. But when you stop reacting, when you observe without engaging, the signal begins to change. The mind starts to realize that the threat is no longer active. The repetition begins to slow. This is not something that happens all at once. It is gradual. Each time the thought appears and you do not follow it, you weaken the pattern. You show the mind that it does not need to hold on to it so tightly. And slowly the space between repetitions grows. There is less urgency, less emotional pull, less need to revisit the same moment. You may still notice the memory, but it feels different, lighter, more distant, like something that belongs to another time, not something that defines your present. This is where peace begins to deepen, not because the past is erased, but because it is no longer being relived. You begin to see that the mind was never trying to hurt you. It was trying to protect you in the only way it knew how. By remembering, by repeating, by holding on. And once you understand that, there is no need to fight it. There is only a quiet shift from reacting to observing, from resisting to allowing, from believing every repetition means something must be done, to knowing that sometimes nothing needs to be done at all. And in that knowing, the mind begins to rest. The repetitions lose their strength. The patterns lose their hold. And what once felt like a constant return to pain becomes something that passes through without staying. You are no longer trapped in the loop. You are simply aware of it, without being inside it. And from that awareness, the mind begins to settle into something steadier. A place where the past can exist without controlling the present. A place where repetition is no longer a signal to act, but a reminder that the mind is slowly learning to let go. And as the mind begins to understand that repetition is not a command, but a pattern, another quiet habit comes into view. A habit that feels almost automatic. The need to follow every thought to its end, to complete the story, to see where it leads. There is a certain pull in unfinished thinking, a sense that once a thought begins, it must be carried all the way through, that stopping midway would leave something unresolved. And so the mind continues, building one idea on top of another, stretching a single moment into a long chain of mental movement. But most of these storylines were never meant to go that far. They begin small, a memory, a question, a passing idea, and then, without noticing, the mind expands it. It adds details. It imagines outcomes. It creates connections that were never there in the first place.
This is how a simple thought becomes a long mental journey, and the longer it continues, the harder it feels to step away.
There is a quiet assumption behind this habit, that completion brings relief, that if you follow the thought all the way, you will reach clarity. But often, the opposite happens. The more you continue, the more complex it becomes. The more details are added, the more the mind has to manage. And so the cycle continues, not because it is helping, but because it was never interrupted. There is a different approach, one that feels simple but requires awareness, the ability to step away even when the thought has not finished. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to completing what it starts. It may tell you that stopping midway is careless, that something important will be missed. But what is being missed, really? Most of these thoughts are not leading anywhere new. They are extending what is already known, repeating patterns in different forms, and the longer they continue, the more they pull you away from the present. When you begin to notice this, you can choose differently. As a thought starts to build, watch how it begins to expand. Notice the moment it starts to grow beyond its original form. That is where the choice appears. Instead of continuing, pause. Let the thought remain unfinished. You are not pushing it away. You are not rejecting it. You are simply not continuing the story. You are stepping out before it takes you further. At first, the mind may try to pull you back in. It may return to the same thought, trying to complete what was left open. But if you remain steady, if you do not follow, the pull begins to weaken. The thought loses its direction. And without direction, it fades. There is a quiet freedom in not needing to finish every mental path, in allowing thoughts to remain incomplete without feeling disturbed by it, in realizing that not every beginning needs an ending. This is where the mind begins to feel lighter. There is less build-up, less extension, fewer long chains of thinking pulling you away. Thoughts become shorter, simpler, easier to let go. You begin to notice that clarity does not come from completing every thought. It comes from not getting lost in them. The more you practice stepping away midway, the more natural it becomes. The urge to follow every thought weakens. The need to complete every storyline fades. And in its place, a different rhythm begins to form. Thoughts arise and pass, without needing to be extended, without needing to be resolved, without needing to be finished. This is not about stopping thinking altogether. It is about changing your relationship with it, about realizing that you are not required to follow every path your mind creates. You can choose where to step in and where to step away, and that choice creates space. Space for stillness, space for rest, space where the mind is no longer filled with long, unfinished stories, but open, quiet moments. As this space grows, the mind begins to settle more deeply. It is no longer constantly moving from one thought to the next, building and extending without pause. It becomes steady, not because there are no thoughts, but because they are no longer being carried so far. And in that steadiness, something calm begins to take hold. A quiet understanding that you do not need to complete every thought to feel at peace, that you can step away at any point, and nothing is lost. Only the weight is released. And as that weight falls away, the mind finally begins to rest in a way it has not in a long time. Not chasing endings, not building stories, just being here, without needing to go further. And as the mind becomes more comfortable stepping away before every thought reaches its end, another quiet shift begins to take place. A deeper one, not just in how you think, but in what you value about thinking itself. There has always been a hidden pride in being mentally sharp. Quick responses, fast analysis, the ability to solve, to explain, to outthink situations before they unfold. It feels like strength, like control, like intelligence at work.
But there is a cost that often goes unnoticed.
The sharper the mind becomes in constant motion, the harder it is for it to become still. There is a subtle habit of always trying to figure things out, to stay mentally active, to keep the mind engaged, even when there is nothing that truly needs attention. And over time, this creates a quiet restlessness, a sense that the mind must always be doing something to stay valuable. But what if that is not true? What if the real strength is not in always thinking, but in knowing when not to? There is a different kind of intelligence that does not rush, that does not need to respond to everything, that does not measure its worth by how quickly it can analyze or react. It is the intelligence of stillness. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. The mind is used to movement, to proving itself, to staying active. So when there is nothing to solve, nothing to analyze, it may feel like something is missing, but nothing is missing. What is present is simply quieter. There is a calm that begins to appear when you stop trying to be mentally sharp at every moment. A sense of ease that does not come from having answers, but from not needing them constantly. You begin to notice that many situations do not require immediate understanding, that not every moment needs to be interpreted, that sometimes the clearest response is no response at all. This is where stillness becomes strength, not because it avoids thinking, but because it is not controlled by it. You are no longer reacting from habit, no longer trying to stay one step ahead mentally. You are simply present, without the pressure to prove anything to yourself. There is also a quiet release here. The release from needing to be right in your own mind, from needing to refine every thought until it feels perfect, from needing to understand everything before allowing yourself to rest. You begin to see that constant cleverness is not peace. It is activity, and activity, when it does not stop, becomes noise. The Stoics understood that a calm mind sees more clearly than a busy one. That wisdom is not measured by how much you think, but by how well you can remain steady when thinking is not needed. When you allow yourself to be still, something else becomes visible. A clarity that does not come from effort, a quiet awareness that does not need to be constructed. It is already there. You may notice moments where the mind is not trying to figure anything out, where there is no internal dialogue pushing forward, just a quiet presence, a simple awareness of being here. Those moments are not empty, they are full of peace, and the more you allow them, the more they grow. There is a gentle shift in how you move through your own mind. Less urgency to think, less need to respond, more comfort in simply observing without adding anything. You are no longer trying to be mentally sharp all the time.
You are allowing yourself to be mentally at ease.
This does not make you less capable. It makes you more balanced, more grounded, more in control of where your attention goes. Because now, thinking becomes a choice, not a constant.
You use it when it is needed, and when it is not, you rest.
And that rest becomes valuable. More valuable than having the perfect response. More valuable than analyzing every situation. More valuable than staying mentally active without pause. Because in that rest the mind recovers, it resets. It returns to a state where clarity is natural, not forced. And as you continue, this balance becomes familiar. The ability to think when needed, and to be still when it is not. You no longer measure your mind by how active it is. You begin to recognize its strength by how peaceful it can remain. And in that recognition, something settles deeply. A quiet confidence, a steady calm, a mind that does not need to prove itself through constant cleverness, because it has discovered something far more powerful, the ability to be still. And as the mind begins to value stillness over constant activity, another quiet pattern starts to loosen. one that has been running in the background for a long time, the need to be understood, the silent effort to explain yourself even when no one is asking. There is a subtle tension that appears after certain interactions, words that were said, words that were not said, moments that feel slightly incomplete, and almost without noticing, the mind begins to replay them, adjusting sentences, rewriting explanations, imagining how things could have been clearer. It feels like unfinished communication.
But look closely. The conversation is already over.
No one is listening now. No one is waiting for that perfect explanation. And yet the mind continues, building sentences in silence, as if clarity can still be achieved by thinking about it long enough. This is where the habit forms. The belief that if you explain yourself better, if you find the right words, if you organize your thoughts perfectly, you will finally be understood, and that understanding will bring relief. But most of the time, this relief never comes, because the mind is not actually resolving anything. It is only rehearsing, speaking into an empty space, trying to complete something that no longer exists. There is a deeper truth here. Not everyone will understand you. Not every moment will be explained perfectly, and not every thought needs to be translated into words for it to be valid. But the mind struggles with this. It wants clarity. It wants recognition. It wants to be seen in the way it sees itself. And when that does not happen, it keeps trying, quietly, repeatedly, internally. This is where overthinking hides in a very subtle way, not as worry, but as explanation. You may notice how often the mind returns to a situation, trying to refine what was said, trying to create a version that feels complete, trying to imagine how it would sound if you had another chance. But there is no second conversation happening. There is only the echo, and you are not required to answer it. There is a quiet freedom in letting that echo remain unanswered, in not continuing the explanation, in not trying to perfect what has already passed. At first, this may feel like something is being left unfinished, like you are walking away from a loose end. But what is actually happening is the release of something that no longer needs your energy. Not every thought needs to be explained. Not every experience needs to be translated into words. And not every part of you needs to be understood by others for it to be at peace within you. When the mind begins to rehearse, notice the movement, the way it builds sentences, the way it prepares responses, the way it tries to organize meaning where there is no longer an audience. Instead of following that movement, pause. Let the explanation remain incomplete. You do not need to finish the sentence in your head. You do not need to arrive at the perfect version. You can simply let it stop, exactly where it is. And in that pause, something shifts. The pressure to explain begins to fade. The need to be understood softens. You begin to see that peace does not come from being perfectly expressed. It comes from being at ease without needing to explain at all. There is a quiet confidence in this, a sense that you do not need to justify your thoughts, your actions, your existence in every moment, that you can simply be without constantly translating yourself for others, even in your own mind. As this becomes more natural, the mental rehearsals begin to fade. The repeated explanations lose their pull. The urge to go back and refine every conversation becomes weaker, and in its place, something calmer begins to grow.
A space where you are not constantly speaking internally.
A space where the mind is not trying to be heard, just quiet awareness, without the need for words.
You begin to carry less
unfinished dialogue, less imagined conversations, less pressure to make everything clear. And with that release, the mind becomes lighter, more open, more still. You are no longer trying to be understood in every moment. You are simply allowing yourself to exist without explanation. And in that quiet acceptance, something settles deeply. A calm that does not depend on others hearing you. A peace that does not require validation. A mind that finally rests, because it is no longer trying to speak when no one is listening. And as the need to explain begins to fall away, something deeper starts to reveal itself. Not another thought, not another idea, but a quiet presence that was always there, hidden beneath the noise. There is a moment, subtle and easy to miss, when the mind is not saying anything. No words forming, no images building, just a brief pause. And within that pause, something steady remains. It does not think, it does not react. It simply is. For a long time it may have felt like thinking is what keeps you aware, that without thoughts there would be nothing. But if you look closely, you begin to notice something different. Even when thoughts are not present, you are still here, aware, present, without needing to say anything about it. This is the silence beneath thought. Not something you create, but something you uncover when the mind is no longer filled with constant activity. It is not empty in the way the mind fears. It is clear, open, still. At first, this silence may feel unfamiliar. The mind is used to filling every space, commenting on everything, explaining, analyzing, reacting. So when there is no thought, it may feel like something is missing, but nothing is missing. What you are touching is something more stable than thought itself. Thoughts come and go. They change, they move, they disappear. But this awareness remains. It is present before a thought begins, and it is still present after it ends. You do not need to think to be aware. This realization is quiet but powerful, because it shifts where you place your attention. Instead of being pulled into every thought, you begin to rest in the space where thoughts appear. You begin to notice the silence that exists before, between, and after them. And that silence has a different quality. It does not rush. It does not demand. It does not carry tension. It simply holds everything without being disturbed by it. When a thought arises, you can notice it from this place, without stepping into it, without needing to follow it, just seeing it appear and then fade while you remain unchanged. There is a deep sense of calm in this, not because the mind has stopped completely, but because you are no longer depending on it to feel present. You are no longer tied to its movement. You are resting beneath it. At first, this may only last for a moment, a brief gap, a short pause where the mind is quiet. But even that is enough to show you what is possible. And the more you notice it, the more it grows. Not by force, but by recognition. You begin to return to it naturally, to sit in that silence without needing to fill it, to allow the mind to settle without trying to control it. There is a different kind of rest here. Not the rest that comes from distraction or exhaustion, but a deeper stillness. A quiet ease that does not depend on what the mind is doing. You may notice that even when thoughts appear again, they feel lighter, less intrusive, less demanding, because you know there is something beneath them that is untouched, something steady, something calm. This is where overthinking begins to lose its foundation, because overthinking depends on your full involvement with thought. It depends on you being inside every idea, every narrative, every movement of the mind. But when you rest in awareness instead, the thoughts no longer have the same hold. They pass through, and you remain. There is nothing you need to do to create this silence. It is already here. It has always been here. It was simply covered by constant engagement. Now, as that engagement softens, the silence reveals itself more clearly. You begin to trust it, to return to it, to recognize that this is where peace truly lives.
Not in solving every thought, not in controlling every outcome,
but in resting in the space where thinking is no longer necessary. And as you stay here, even for a few moments, something shifts deeply. The mind begins to settle. The noise becomes softer. And what remains is not emptiness, but a quiet, steady presence that has nothing to prove, nothing to solve, and nothing to chase. Just awareness, at rest. And as that quiet awareness becomes more familiar, something even more subtle begins to unfold. Not just how you see your thoughts, but how you respond to them from within. The silent reactions that happen before any action is taken, the quick shifts in feeling, the internal movements that no one else sees. There is a moment, almost instant, when a thought appears and the mind reacts to it. A memory brings discomfort. A worry brings tension. A passing idea creates resistance. And before you even notice, there is an internal response. A tightening, a judgment, a push or a pull. It happens so quickly that it feels automatic, but it is not.
There is a space, small but real, between the thought and the reaction. And within that space lies a different possibility, the ability to not react.
This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean suppressing emotion or pretending nothing is there. It means allowing the thought and the feeling to exist without adding another layer on top of them. Because most of the weight you carry does not come from the first thought. It comes from the reaction to it. A simple memory appears, and then the mind reacts, judging it, resisting it, trying to change it. That reaction creates tension, and that tension invites more thoughts, more reactions, more layers, and suddenly something small becomes overwhelming. But what if you did not add that second layer?
What if you allowed the thought to appear and simply remained still?
At first, this feels unfamiliar. The mind is used to responding quickly, to labeling things as good or bad, to agreeing or resisting. So when you choose not to react, it may feel like something is missing, but nothing is missing. What you are doing is allowing the experience to remain simple. When a thought brings discomfort, notice the immediate urge to respond, the impulse to push it away, to analyze it, to fix it. Instead of following that impulse, pause. Let the feeling be there without changing it.
This is where emotional neutrality begins.
Not as indifference, but as steadiness.
You are not denying what is present. You are not pretending it does not exist. You are simply not amplifying it with additional reaction.
There is a quiet strength in this, a strength that does not come from controlling your thoughts, but from not being controlled by your reactions to them. You may notice that when you stop reacting internally, the intensity of the thought begins to fade on its own. The feeling softens, the tension loosens, not because you forced it, but because you did not add to it.
This is how the mind begins to settle.
Not through effort, but through non-interference. Over time, this becomes more natural. The space between thought and reaction becomes clearer. The urge to respond weakens, and you begin to experience thoughts without being pulled into emotional waves each time they appear. There is a calm that grows here, a sense that you can face anything within your mind without being shaken by it, that you can sit with discomfort without needing to escape it, that you can allow thoughts to rise and fall without reacting to every movement. This is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming stable. about not letting every internal event create a reaction that disturbs your peace. You begin to move through your own mind with more ease, less resistance, less tension, more acceptance of what is without needing to change it immediately. And in that acceptance, something shifts deeply. The mind becomes quieter, the emotional swings become softer, the need to react fades. You are no longer caught in a constant cycle of thought, followed by reaction, followed by more thought. There is space now, space to simply observe, space to feel without being overwhelmed, space to remain steady, even when the mind presents something uncomfortable. And within that space, a different kind of peace begins to take root, not fragile, not dependent on circumstances, but grounded, stable, quietly strong. You are no longer reacting to everything that happens within you. You are allowing it, without losing yourself in it. And from that place, the mind begins to rest more deeply. Not because it has nothing to show you, but because you are no longer disturbed by what it shows. You remain steady, and in that steadiness, true calm begins to live. And as you begin to remain steady within your own mind, something even clearer starts to reveal itself. A distinction that was always there, but easily overlooked. The difference between thinking and being aware. For a long time, they may have felt like the same thing, as if thinking is what keeps you present, as if the more you think, the more aware you are. But if you look closely, you begin to notice something very different. Thinking pulls you in.
Awareness allows you to stay.
There is a certain weight that comes with thinking. It builds. It connects one idea to another. It creates movement, direction, and often tension. Once you are inside a thought, it begins to carry you from one point to the next, from one possibility to another, and without noticing, you are no longer here. You are somewhere in the mind. But awareness feels different. It does not move in the same way. It does not build or expand. It simply observes what is already present. The breath, the body, the space around you, even the thoughts themselves. It does not pull you in. It keeps you where you are. This is the quiet difference. Thinking consumes your attention. Awareness holds it. When you are thinking, your focus narrows. It becomes centered on the thought itself. You begin to follow it, expand it, engage with it. And the more you follow, the deeper you go. But when you are aware, your attention opens. It does not attach to any single thing. It sees the thought, but it also sees the space around it. It notices without being drawn in. There is no urgency in awareness. No need to continue. No pressure to solve. It simply allows. At first, this difference may feel subtle. The mind moves quickly, and it is easy to slip from awareness back into thinking without realizing it. But with practice, the distinction becomes clearer. You begin to notice the moment when a thought starts to pull you, and you begin to recognize that you can step back. Not by force, not by resistance, but by returning to awareness. You do not need to stop the thought. You only need to stop following it. And when you do, something shifts. The thought remains, but it no longer carries you. It becomes something you can see instead of something you are inside. This is where the mind begins to feel lighter, because you are no longer being consumed by every idea that appears. You are no longer being pulled from one thought to the next. You are simply here, observing. There is a quiet stability in this, a sense that you are no longer at the mercy of the mind's movement, that you can remain present, even when thoughts continue to come and go. You may notice that awareness does not tire in the same way thinking does. Thinking requires effort. It builds, it connects, it moves constantly, and over time it becomes exhausting. But awareness is still. It does not need to do anything. It is already present without effort. And the more you rest in it, the more natural it becomes. You begin to spend less time being carried by thoughts, and more time simply observing them. Less time consumed, and more time grounded. This is where a deeper calm begins to form, not from controlling the mind, but from no longer being pulled into every direction it moves. You begin to trust this awareness, to return to it when the mind becomes busy, to rest in it when nothing needs to be done. And in that resting, something settles. The noise becomes softer. The movement slows. And what remains is not emptiness, but clarity. A quiet presence that does not depend on thinking to exist. As this becomes more familiar, overthinking begins to lose its hold, because it can only continue when you are inside it. Once you step back into awareness, the chain breaks.
The thoughts may still appear, but they no longer carry you.
And you remain where you are, present, steady, unaffected.
This is the difference.
Not in what the mind produces, but in where you choose to stand. Inside the thought, or outside it. Consumed, or aware.
And in choosing awareness, again and again, the mind begins to rest in a way it never has before. Not because thinking has stopped, but because it is no longer taking you with it.
And as you begin to rest more in awareness than in constant thinking, another quiet pattern starts to loosen its grip, one that often hides behind caution, the habit of looking ahead and expecting the worst. There is a subtle movement in the mind that tries to go into the future before it arrives. It takes a simple possibility and stretches it into a full scenario. It fills in details. It builds outcomes. And most of the time, those outcomes carry tension. Things going wrong, things falling apart, things not working out the way you hoped. It feels like preparation. As if the mind is trying to protect you by showing you what could happen, but in truth, it is creating experiences that do not exist, and then reacting to them as if they are real. This is how overthinking moves forward in time, not by living what is happening, but by simulating what has not happened. And the body follows. The moment the mind begins to predict, the feeling changes. The breath becomes tighter. The chest holds a slight weight. The energy shifts from calm to alert, all in response to something that is not actually present. This is the illusion. The future is not here, but the reaction is. There is a deeper habit beneath this, the belief that expecting the worst somehow prepares you, that if you think through every negative outcome, you will be ready, that you will avoid surprise, avoid disappointment, avoid pain. But what actually happens is the opposite. You experience the discomfort in advance. You carry it before it arrives, and often it never arrives at all. The mind creates a version of the future, and you live it emotionally, even though it may never become real. This is not preparation. This is repetition of fear. Breaking this habit begins with a simple awareness. The moment you notice the mind moving forward, building scenarios, predicting outcomes that have not occurred, pause there. Do not continue the story. You do not need to complete the scenario. You do not need to explore every possibility. You can let the thought remain unfinished. At first, the mind may resist this. It may try to pull you deeper into the prediction. It may present the scenario more vividly, more urgently, trying to convince you that it needs to be considered. But look closely. Nothing is happening right now. You are here, breathing, present, and the future remains untouched. There is a quiet strength in returning to this moment, in refusing to travel forward mentally when there is no need, in choosing not to carry what has not arrived. You begin to see that most of these predictions are not based on certainty, but on memory, past experiences, past fears, past discomforts being projected forward. The mind is not showing you the future. It is repeating the past in a different direction. And once you see that, the pull begins to weaken. You are no longer treating the prediction as truth. You are recognizing it as a pattern. There is also a deeper trust that begins to grow here. Not the trust that everything will go perfectly, but the trust that you can respond when the moment comes. You do not need to live it now. You can meet it when it arrives. And that changes everything. The mind becomes quieter, less driven to move ahead, less filled with imagined outcomes, more grounded in what is actually present. You begin to notice how much lighter it feels when you are not carrying the future in your thoughts, when you are not preparing for problems that do not exist. There is more space, more calm, more clarity. You are no longer reacting to what might happen. You are simply here with what is. And in that presence, something settles. The constant movement forward slows down. The scenarios fade. The need to predict weakens. And what remains is a steady awareness that does not need to look ahead to feel safe. You are here, and that is enough. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose another layer of its hold. Because it can no longer pull you into futures that are not real, it can no longer create tension from what has not happened. You remain where life is actually unfolding, not ahead of it, not behind it, but here, and from here, the mind finally begins to rest. Not because the future is controlled, but because it is no longer being carried before its time. And as the mind stops reaching into the future to protect itself, another pattern quietly comes into view. One that feels familiar, almost automatic. The need to defend. Not out loud, but internally. Explaining yourself to people who are not there. Justifying actions that have already passed. Preparing responses for situations that are not even happening. It often begins in silence. A thought appears, and with it, a sense that something about you needs to be protected. Your choices, your words, your image. And almost instantly, the mind starts building a defense. Quiet arguments form. Explanations begin to take shape, as if someone, somewhere, is questioning you. But no one is. There is no conversation taking place. And yet the mind continues, speaking into empty space, trying to secure a position that no one is attacking. This is where a hidden weight forms. Because every time you defend yourself internally, you reinforce the idea that something is wrong, that something needs to be corrected, justified, or proven. And without realizing it, you begin to carry that pressure with you.
Even in moments of rest.
Even when nothing is happening. There is a constant sense of needing to explain, to be right, to be understood. But what if none of that is required right now? There is a quiet freedom in realizing that you do not need to defend yourself in your own mind, that not every thought needs to be answered, that not every imagined criticism deserves a response, because most of the time, the situation you are defending against does not exist. It is only a projection, a voice created by the mind, shaped by past experiences, expectations, or fears. And once it appears, the mind reacts as if it must respond. But you can choose not to. When the urge to defend arises, notice it. The way the mind starts to build sentences, the way it prepares explanations, the way it tries to make everything clear, even when there is no one listening. Instead of following that movement, pause. Let the need to defend be there without acting on it. You do not need to complete the argument. You do not need to justify your actions. You do not need to explain who you are to a voice that is not real. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to protecting itself. It may feel like you are leaving something unresolved, like you are not standing up for yourself. But what are you standing up against? There is no real conflict in this moment, only a thought. And thoughts do not need defense. As you begin to step back from this habit, something shifts. The pressure to be right begins to fade. The need to explain weakens. The internal conversations become quieter. You start to notice how much energy was being used to maintain these invisible arguments, energy that can now return to stillness. There is also a deeper confidence that grows here. Not the confidence of proving yourself, but the confidence of not needing to. The understanding that your worth is not determined by how well you defend yourself in your own mind. You do not need to convince yourself of your value. You can simply rest in it. This does not mean you avoid real conversations when they matter. It means you stop creating unnecessary ones when they do not. You begin to recognize the difference between a real situation and a mental one. And you stop treating both the same. As this becomes more natural, the mind becomes lighter, less filled with explanations, less driven to justify, more open, more quiet. You are no longer carrying invisible debates. You are no longer responding to voices that were never spoken. You are simply here, without needing to prove anything. And in that simplicity, something settles deeply. A calm that comes from not being in constant defense. A space where you are not preparing responses, not building arguments, not explaining yourself endlessly. Just present. Just still. And from that stillness, the mind begins to rest more fully. No longer guarded, no longer tense, but open and at ease, free from the need to defend what was never under attack. And as the need to defend yourself begins to fall away, the mind enters a quieter space. Fewer arguments, fewer explanations, less tension around what needs to be said or proven. But even in this calm, there is another subtle habit still shaping your experience. The habit of labeling everything that appears. A thought arises, and almost instantly it is judged. Good or bad, right or wrong, useful or pointless, welcome or unwanted. This happens so quickly that it feels natural, almost invisible. But that single act of labeling changes the entire experience. Because the moment a thought is labeled, it is no longer just a thought. It becomes something you react to. A simple idea appears, and if it is labeled as negative, the mind resists it. If it is labeled as positive, the mind tries to hold on to it. And in both cases, the mind becomes involved. It moves away from observing and into controlling. This is where the disturbance begins, not from the thought itself, but from the judgment placed on it. Without labels, a thought is light. It comes, it stays briefly, and it leaves. But once it is judged, it gains weight. It becomes something to manage, something to deal with, something to either keep or remove. And the more this happens, the more the mind stays active, constantly sorting, evaluating, deciding. There is a different way to meet your thoughts, one that does not involve labeling at all. When a thought appears, simply notice it, without naming it, without deciding what it means, without placing it into a category. Just let it be what it is. At first, this may feel unusual. The mind is used to identifying everything. It wants to understand, to define, to place each thought into a clear space. So when you stop doing that, it may feel like something is incomplete. But nothing is incomplete. What you are doing is allowing the thought to exist in its simplest form, without judgment, without reaction, without meaning attached to it. And in that simplicity, something changes. The thought loses its emotional charge, because it is no longer being treated as something important or threatening. It is just there. You may notice how quickly thoughts begin to pass when they are not labeled. They do not stay as long. They do not build into something larger. They do not pull you in the same way. They move freely. This is where the mind begins to feel lighter. Not because there are no thoughts, but because there is no constant judgment shaping them. You are no longer reacting to each thought based on whether it is good or bad. You are simply allowing it to appear and disappear.
There is a quiet neutrality in this.
A steady way of being where the mind is not constantly shifting between attraction and resistance. You begin to experience thoughts without being affected by them in the same way.
They come and they go.
And you remain unchanged. This does not mean you stop understanding your thoughts when needed. It means you stop automatically judging them in the moment they appear. You give yourself space. Space to observe without reacting. Space to let things pass without interference.
And in that space, the mind begins to settle.
The constant activity of labeling fades. The need to control what appears softens. And what remains is a calm, open awareness that does not depend on sorting every experience. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose another layer of its hold. Because overthinking depends on judgment. It depends on labeling something as a problem, something as important, something as needing attention. Once that labeling stops, the thoughts no longer carry the same weight. They are no longer seen as something that must be handled. They are simply passing experiences, and you are free to let them pass. There is a quiet peace in this, a way of being where the mind is not constantly reacting, not constantly deciding, not constantly judging, just observing, just allowing.
And in that allowing, something settles deeply.
A calm that does not come from controlling your thoughts, but from no longer interfering with them. A stillness that remains, even as thoughts move through. And from that stillness, the mind finally begins to rest in a deeper, more effortless way. Not labeling, not judging, just being. And as the habit of labeling begins to fade, something deeper starts to reveal itself. A quiet truth that was always hidden beneath the surface of thinking. Not all thoughts are there to understand something. Some are there to avoid feeling something. There is a subtle shift that happens when a feeling begins to rise. It could be discomfort, sadness, uncertainty. And almost immediately, the mind steps in. It begins to think, to analyze, to create movement, as if thinking can protect you from what you're about to feel. At first, this feels natural. It feels like you are handling the situation. But if you look closely, something is being replaced. Instead of feeling the emotion directly, the mind builds thoughts around it. It explains it. It questions it. It tries to solve it. And in doing so, it keeps you at a distance from the feeling itself. This is where overthinking becomes a form of avoidance, not because you are trying to escape on purpose, but because the mind has learned that thinking feels safer than feeling. A feeling is immediate. It is present in the body. It has no clear direction. It cannot be controlled in the same way. But thinking creates structure. It gives the mind something to hold on to, something to manage. So the mind chooses thinking again and again. You may notice this when something emotional happens. Instead of sitting with the feeling, the mind starts asking questions. Why did this happen? What does it mean? What should I do next? How could this have been different? The questions continue, not because they are leading to clarity, but because they are keeping you away from the feeling. And the feeling remains unprocessed. It stays beneath the thoughts, waiting. This is why overthinking often feels endless, because the mind is moving around something it is not allowing itself to feel. There is a different way to meet this. When a thought begins to build around a feeling, pause. Instead of following the thought, bring your attention to what is underneath it.
Not the story, but the sensation.
Where is it in the body? What does it feel like without putting it into words? You may notice a tightness, a heaviness, a warmth, something subtle but real. Stay there. Do not rush to explain it. Do not try to solve it. Just allow it to be felt. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to stepping in quickly to avoid this exact moment, so it may try to pull you back into thinking. It may present more questions, more ideas, more distractions. But if you remain with the feeling, without turning it into thought, something begins to shift.
The intensity changes.
Not because you forced it to, but because you allowed it to move. Feelings, when fully experienced, do not stay the same.
They rise and they fall.
But when they are avoided, when they are covered by constant thinking, they remain.
They repeat.
They return in different forms. Not because they are unsolvable, but because they were never fully felt. There is a quiet courage in allowing yourself to feel without immediately turning it into thought. A willingness to sit with discomfort without trying to escape it. And in that willingness, something begins to release. The mind no longer needs to build so many thoughts, because there is nothing being avoided.
The feeling moves through, and it softens.
And once it softens, the thoughts that surrounded it lose their purpose. They begin to fade. You are no longer thinking to avoid. You are allowing. And in that allowing, the need to overthink begins to dissolve. There is also a deeper understanding that grows here. Not every emotion needs to be explained. Not every feeling needs a story.
Some things simply need to be experienced and then allowed to pass.
As this becomes more natural, the mind becomes quieter. Not because you forced it to stop, but because it no longer needs to protect you from what you are willing to face. You begin to trust your ability to feel without being overwhelmed. To sit with what arises without turning it into endless thought. And in that trust, something settles deeply. A calm that does not come from avoiding discomfort, but from no longer fearing it.
A stillness that remains even when emotions pass through.
Because you are no longer running from them. You are allowing them. And in that allowance, the mind finally begins to rest. Not moving in circles around what it fears, but grounded in the quiet strength of facing it directly. And from that place, overthinking begins to lose its foundation completely, because there is nothing left to avoid. And as the mind no longer needs to think its way around every feeling, another quiet pressure begins to loosen, one that often shows up at the end of the day, when everything is finally still, when there is nothing left to do except rest. That is when the mind starts asking for answers. There is a subtle belief that before you can sleep, something must be solved, that the day must be completed, understood, organized, that loose ends must be tied, questions must be answered, and clarity must be reached before the body is allowed to rest. And so the mind begins to work again. It revisits moments. It replays conversations. It searches for conclusions. It tries to make sense of everything before letting go, as if sleep is something that must be earned through resolution. But look closely. The day is already over. Nothing you think about now will change what has happened.
And yet the mind continues, as if it must carry everything into the night. This is where rest becomes difficult.
Not because the body cannot relax, but because the mind refuses to stop working. There is a quiet misunderstanding here.
Sleep does not require completion.
It does not require answers. It does not depend on everything being figured out. It only asks that you let go. But letting go feels unfamiliar when the mind is used to holding on, used to solving, used to finishing what it starts. So when you lie down, the same habit continues. The need to resolve, the need to understand, the need to reach some kind of mental conclusion before allowing yourself to rest. But what if none of that is necessary? What if rest comes not from solving everything, but from allowing things to remain unsolved? There is a gentle shift that can happen here. When the mind begins to search for answers at night, instead of following it, pause. Notice the urge, the feeling that something must be figured out, and then, quietly, do nothing. You do not need to complete the thought. You do not need to reach a conclusion. You can let the question remain open and still allow your body to rest. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is not used to stopping without resolution. It may bring the same thoughts back again, trying to complete what was left unfinished. But if you remain still, if you do not engage, something begins to soften. The urgency fades, the need to solve weakens, and the thoughts begin to lose their grip. There is a quiet permission in this, the permission to rest, without having everything figured out, to lie down, without carrying the weight of the day, to allow the mind to be unfinished and still be at peace.
You begin to realize that not every day needs to end with clarity.
Some days end with openness. Some questions remain. Some thoughts are left where they are.
And that is enough.
There is also a deeper trust that grows here. The understanding that whatever needs to be addressed can be met tomorrow.
That you do not need to carry it into the night.
That rest itself is more important than resolution, because a rested mind sees more clearly. A tired mind continues to search without direction.
So, by allowing yourself to rest without solving everything, you are not losing anything. You are creating the space for clarity to come naturally.
As this becomes a habit, the nights begin to feel different, less crowded, less restless. The mind no longer tries to finish everything before letting go. It begins to slow down earlier, to soften,
To release.
You may notice moments where thoughts appear, but do not continue, where questions arise, but are not followed, where the mind feels open, not because everything is solved, but because nothing is being held on to. And in that openness, sleep comes more easily, not forced, not chased, but allowed. You are no longer waiting for the perfect moment to rest. You are resting as you are, with things unfinished, with questions unanswered, with the day left exactly where it is. And in that acceptance, something settles deeply. A quiet ease, a gentle release. A mind that no longer needs to carry everything into the night. And from that place, rest becomes natural, not something you earn, but something you allow. And as you allow it, overthinking begins to fade even further, because the mind no longer believes it must solve life before it can finally be still. And as the mind begins to rest without needing to resolve everything, another quiet truth starts to settle in. Even in stillness, thoughts may continue to appear, not as problems, not as something to fix, but simply as movement. There is a common expectation that peace means silence, that once the mind is calm, there will be no more thoughts. But what you begin to notice is something different. Thoughts may still come, but they no longer disturb you in the same way, because you are no longer fighting them. There is a subtle resistance that often goes unnoticed. The moment a thought appears, especially one you do not like, there is an immediate reaction, a push to stop it, a desire to remove it, a quiet frustration that it is even there. And that resistance creates tension, not from the thought itself, but from the fight against it. The more you try to silence the mind by force, the louder it becomes. The more you resist certain thoughts, the more they seem to return. Not because they are powerful, but because resistance keeps them active. This is where the shift begins. Peace does not come from eliminating mental noise. It comes from no longer being disturbed by it. When a thought appears, instead of pushing it away, allow it. Not as something you agree with,
Not as something you follow.
but simply as something that is present for a moment. You are not required to react. You are not required to remove it. You can let it exist without giving it direction. At first, this may feel counterintuitive. The mind is used to control, to fixing, to trying to create silence by force. So when you stop doing that, it may feel like you are allowing too much. But what you are actually allowing is space. Space for thoughts to pass on their own. Without resistance, a thought has nothing to hold on to. It appears, and then it moves. It may stay briefly. It may return again. But each time, if you do not follow it, if you do not fight it, it loses its ability to disturb you. There is a quiet acceptance in this.
Not acceptance of the content of the thought, but acceptance of the fact that thoughts will come and go.
And that this is natural. You begin to see that mental noise is not the problem. The problem was always the reaction to it, the effort to control it, the need to make it stop. Once that effort fades, the mind begins to feel lighter, not because it is empty, but because it is no longer in conflict with itself. You may notice moments where thoughts are present, but there is no tension, no urgency, no need to change anything. They are simply there, passing through, and you remain still. This is where peace deepens, not in silence, but in non-resistance.
You are no longer measuring your calm by how quiet your mind is.
You are recognizing calm as your ability to remain steady, even when thoughts appear. There is a different kind of freedom here, a freedom from needing perfect conditions, a freedom from needing the mind to behave in a certain way before you can feel at ease. You begin to trust that you can sit with whatever arises without being disturbed by it, and that trust changes everything. The mind stops fighting itself, the tension softens, the need to control fades, and what remains is a quiet, steady awareness that is not affected by the movement within it. As this becomes more natural, overthinking loses another layer of its hold, because overthinking depends on engagement and resistance. Without those, the thoughts no longer build. They no longer loop. They no longer stay. They pass, and you remain. Present, calm, unaffected. This is the peace in accepting mental noise, not as something you need to eliminate, but as something that no longer has power over you. And in that acceptance, the mind finally begins to rest, even in the presence of thought. And as the mind stops fighting what appears, another quiet shift begins to take shape. Not just in how thoughts are received, but in how long they stay. Because one of the hidden reasons overthinking feels so heavy is not the number of thoughts, but their duration. A thought appears, and instead of passing through, it lingers. It stretches, it gathers more ideas around it, and before you notice, it becomes something larger than it ever needed to be. But what if a thought did not need to stay that long? There is a natural lifespan to every thought. It arises, it moves, and it fades, just like a sound that appears in the distance and then disappears. But when you engage with it, when you follow it, react to it, or build on it, you extend its life. You give it more time than it needs. This is how a brief moment becomes a long experience. And over time, the mind becomes used to this extension. Thoughts no longer come and go quickly. They settle, they stay, they repeat, not because they are meant to, but because they are being held. There is a different way to relate to this. A quiet practice of allowing thoughts to dissolve quickly without adding to them. When a thought appears, notice how it begins. Simple, clear, before it grows into something more. That is the moment where its lifespan is still short. Instead of continuing it, let it remain as it is. Do not add another layer. Do not connect it to something else. Do not follow where it is trying to lead. Just let it be and watch what happens. Without your involvement, the thought begins to fade. It does not need to stay. It does not need to return. It simply completes its natural course. At first, the mind may resist this. It is used to extending thoughts, to exploring them, to building around them. So it may try to pull you back in. It may bring the thought again, or present it in a slightly different way. But each time you allow it to pass without engagement, something changes. The thought becomes shorter, less complex, less attached. And slowly, the mind begins to learn a new pattern. Thoughts do not need to linger. They can come and go. There is a lightness in this. A sense that the mind is no longer crowded with long, extended thinking. That thoughts are not piling on top of each other, creating layers of tension. Instead, there is space between them, room for stillness.
Room for rest.
You may notice that when thoughts dissolve more quickly, the mind feels clearer. Not because it is empty, but because nothing is being held for too long. There is no build-up, no accumulation, just a steady flow that does not disturb your peace. This is not about forcing thoughts to disappear. It is about not giving them more time than they need. There is a difference. Forcing creates resistance. Allowing creates release. When you allow a thought to dissolve, you are not pushing it away. You are simply not feeding it, not extending it, not turning it into something more. And in that simplicity, the mind begins to settle. Over time, this becomes natural. Thoughts appear and pass quickly. They do not stay long enough to create tension. They do not build into long chains. They do not return with the same strength, because they are no longer being extended. You begin to trust this process, to know that a thought does not need to be followed to be understood, that it does not need to stay to be acknowledged. It can simply pass, and that is enough. And as this becomes more familiar, overthinking begins to lose its structure, because overthinking depends on duration, on thoughts staying long enough to build, connect, and repeat. Once that duration shortens, the entire pattern weakens. The mind becomes lighter, quieter, more at ease.
You are no longer carrying thoughts longer than necessary.
You are allowing them to move naturally, without interference. And in that movement, something settles deeply. A calm that is not interrupted by lingering thoughts. A stillness that is not disturbed by extended thinking. A mind that knows how to let go, quickly, gently, without effort. And from that place, rest becomes easier.
Because nothing is staying longer than it needs to.
Everything is passing, just as it should. And as thoughts begin to dissolve more quickly, another pattern becomes easier to recognize, one that feels endless by nature, a loop that does not move forward but keeps expanding sideways. The quiet habit of asking, "What if?" It often begins as a simple question. What if this goes wrong? What if I made the wrong choice? What if something unexpected happens? At first, it feels like curiosity, like the mind is exploring possibilities, but almost immediately, the question multiplies. One scenario leads to another. One outcome opens the door to 10 more. And before you notice, you are no longer asking one question. You are inside a loop with no ending. This is the nature of what-if thinking. It does not lead to resolution. It leads to more possibilities. Because for every answer the mind creates, another question appears, another angle, another version, another path that could go wrong or unfold differently. And so the loop continues, not because there is something to solve, but because the structure itself has no end. This is what makes it exhausting. You are trying to reach a conclusion in a space that was never designed to have one. The mind believes that if it explores enough possibilities, it will find certainty. That it will eventually arrive at a point where everything feels safe, understood, controlled. But certainty is not found this way. Because the more you explore hypothetical outcomes, the more you realize how many there are. Endless variations, endless directions, endless uncertainty. And so the mind keeps searching, thinking it is getting closer, while actually moving further away. There is a quiet realization that begins to break this loop.
What if thinking is not about finding answers?
It is about feeding uncertainty.
And uncertainty, when followed in this way, does not shrink. It grows. So the shift does not come from answering every what if. It comes from seeing that the question itself does not need to be followed. When a what if thought appears, notice the pull. The way it tries to lead you into a scenario. The way it invites you to explore what could happen next. Instead of stepping in, pause. Let the question remain unanswered.
You do not need to continue it.
You do not need to explore every possibility. You can let the question exist without giving it a path to grow.
At first, this may feel incomplete. The mind is used to continuing the question, to building on it, to trying to resolve it. So when you stop, it may try to bring it back again.
But each time you choose not to follow, something changes. The loop weakens. The question loses its movement. And without movement, it cannot continue in the same way. There is a quiet freedom in not needing to explore every possibility, in allowing uncertainty to exist without trying to control it, in recognizing that not knowing is not something that needs to be fixed immediately. You begin to see that most of these scenarios will never happen, and yet they were being experienced as if they might, carried in the body, felt in the mind, repeated without end. Once you step out of the loop, that weight begins to lift. The mind becomes less crowded with possibilities, less filled with imagined futures.
More grounded in what is actually here.
You are no longer trying to solve a future that has not arrived. You are simply present, without chasing every version of what could be. And in that presence, something settles.
The endless branching of thoughts slows down.
The questions become quieter.
The need to explore every path fades.
Because you no longer believe that peace is found at the end of every what if. You begin to understand that peace is found when you stop following the question altogether. And from that understanding, the mind begins to rest more deeply, not searching, not expanding, not looping, just still, even in the presence of uncertainty. Because you are no longer trying to resolve what has no end. You are simply allowing it to be without stepping inside it. And as the loop of what if begins to loosen, something even simpler starts to reveal itself. A quieter form of freedom, not from thoughts themselves, but from the need to care about all of them. There is a subtle habit the mind holds on to, the belief that every thought deserves attention, that every idea must be considered, evaluated, responded to. And because of that, the mind becomes busy, not with what matters, but with everything. A thought appears, and almost instantly it feels important.
Not because it is, but because it was noticed.
And once it is noticed, the mind begins to engage. It reacts, it follows, it builds, and slowly something that could have passed in a moment becomes something that stays.
But what if not every thought needs to matter?
There is a quiet strength in indifference, not the kind that ignores life, but the kind that does not give equal weight to everything that passes through the mind. Because most thoughts are not signals, they are noise, they are fragments, they are echoes of things that have already passed or things that may never happen. And yet, they are often treated as if they carry meaning. This is where the mind becomes heavy, not from the presence of thoughts, but from the importance given to them. Every thought becomes something to care about, and caring about everything becomes exhausting. There is another way. When a thought appears, instead of immediately giving it value, pause. Let it be there, without deciding what it means. You do not need to care about it. You do not need to follow it. You do not need to respond. You can simply let it exist, and then let it pass. At first, this may feel unusual. The mind is used to attaching importance quickly. It wants to decide. It wants to categorize. It wants to know if the thought matters. But most of the time, it does not. And the more you practice not caring about every thought, the more the mind begins to settle. There is less engagement, less reaction, less build-up. You begin to notice how many thoughts were only heavy because they were taken seriously. And once that seriousness fades, the thoughts themselves lose their weight.
This does not mean you become disconnected.
It means you become selective. You choose what deserves your attention and what does not.
You begin to see that your attention is limited.
And where you place it shapes your experience. So instead of giving it to every passing thought, you hold it more carefully. You allow most things to pass without involvement, and you remain with what is real, what is present, what actually requires you. There is a calm that grows from this, a sense that you are no longer pulled in every direction by the mind, that you are no longer reacting to everything that appears. You are simply here, steady, aware, and undisturbed. This is the strength of mental indifference, not apathy, not avoidance, but the quiet ability to let things pass without making them important. You may notice that when you stop caring about every thought, the mind becomes quieter. Not because thoughts stop appearing, but because they are no longer being held on to. They move through quickly. They do not linger. They do not build. And the space they leave behind begins to grow. That space is where calm lives, where stillness settles, where you are no longer occupied by everything that crosses your mind. You are free, free from needing to engage, free from needing to react, free from carrying what was never meant to stay. And in that freedom, something deep begins to settle, a steady calm, a quiet clarity, a mind that is no longer overwhelmed, because it no longer cares about everything it produces. It simply allows and remains. And as the mind begins to care less about every passing thought, another quiet illusion starts to fade, one that has been guiding your thinking for a long time. The belief that if you think enough, you are in control.
There is a subtle comfort in thinking.
It gives the feeling that something is being managed, that by going over situations, by analyzing outcomes, by preparing mentally, you are influencing what will happen. It creates a sense of involvement, as if staying active in thought is the same as staying in control. But look closely, nothing outside your mind is changing. The situation remains the same. The future has not moved. And yet the mind continues, as if it is shaping something beyond itself. This is where the illusion lives. Thinking feels like action, but it is not always influence. You can think about something for hours, and the world will remain untouched by it. You can replay, analyze, prepare, predict, and still, when the moment arrives, it unfolds in its own way. There is a quiet misunderstanding here. The mind believes that constant thinking keeps you safe, that it gives you an advantage, that it allows you to stay ahead of what is coming. But in reality, most of this thinking does not change anything. It only changes how you feel. It creates tension. It builds pressure. It gives the sense that something must be controlled, even when it cannot be. This is why overthinking feels heavy. Not because you are doing something useful, but because you are carrying something unnecessary. There is a difference between thoughtful action and endless thinking. Action is clear. It is connected to the present. It leads somewhere. Thinking, when it becomes excessive, circles. It repeats. It creates movement without direction, and often it gives the illusion of progress without any real change. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You no longer treat every thought as something that needs to be followed. You begin to question the need to think about everything. When a thought appears, especially one that tries to pull you into control, pause. Ask yourself quietly, does this thought change anything right now? Most of the time it does not. And in that moment, you have a choice: to continue thinking or to let it pass. There is a quiet strength in choosing not to engage, in recognizing that your peace is not dependent on controlling every outcome, that your mind does not need to stay active to keep things in place. You begin to trust something different, not your ability to think through everything, but your ability to respond when it matters. Because real influence does not come from thinking in advance. It comes from how you meet the moment when it arrives. And that cannot be rehearsed. It cannot be controlled from a distance. It can only be experienced directly. This realization brings a kind of relief. The pressure to think constantly begins to fade. The need to stay mentally active softens, and the mind begins to rest. Not because everything is under control, but because it no longer needs to be. You may notice that when you stop trying to control things through thought, there is more space, more calm, more presence. You are no longer trying to manage the future from your mind. You are simply here, allowing things to unfold. And in that allowance, something becomes clear. Life is not shaped by how much you think about it. It is shaped by how you live it, moment by moment, without carrying unnecessary weight, without trying to control what cannot be controlled. And as this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose another layer of its hold, because it can no longer convince you that thinking equals influence. You see it for what it is: a habit, a pattern, a movement that once felt necessary, but is no longer needed. And from that understanding, the mind begins to settle more deeply. Not trying to control, not trying to manage, just present, steady, and at ease. Free from the illusion that constant thinking is what keeps life in place. And as the illusion of control begins to fall away, something deeper starts to surface. Not as thought, but as feeling. A quiet unease that was always there beneath the constant thinking. A tension that the mind had been trying to manage, avoid, or control. Now, without that constant effort, it becomes more visible. This is where anxiety often appears, not as something new, but as something that was always present, just covered by mental activity. There is a natural instinct when anxiety arises. The body tightens, the breath shifts, the mind immediately looks for a way out. It tries to understand it, fix it, escape it. It searches for relief as quickly as possible, because discomfort feels like something that should not be there.
But what if that instinct is what keeps it alive?
Anxiety is not only in the feeling itself, it is also in the reaction to it. The moment it appears, the mind begins to respond. It asks questions. It builds thoughts. It tries to push the feeling away. And in doing so, it gives the feeling more attention, more energy, more space to grow. This is where the cycle continues.
Feeling, reaction, more feeling, more reaction.
But there is another way to meet this.
A quieter way, one that does not involve escaping. When anxiety appears, instead of reacting, pause. Do not try to change it. Do not try to remove it. Just notice it. Where is it in the body?
How does it feel, without turning it into a story?
There may be a tightness in the chest, a slight pressure in the stomach, a subtle restlessness in the body. Let it be there, without naming it as good or bad, without trying to understand why it is there. Just feel it as it is. At first, this may feel difficult. The mind is used to reacting quickly. It wants to do something. It wants to escape. So when you remain still, it may feel like you are not handling it properly. But what you are actually doing is breaking the cycle. You are allowing the feeling to exist without feeding it with more thought, and something begins to shift. The anxiety, when not reacted to, does not grow in the same way. It may still be there, but it becomes softer, less intense, less demanding, because it is no longer being amplified by the mind.
There is a quiet understanding that grows here.
Anxiety is not something you need to run from. It is something that moves through you when you stop resisting it. Like a wave that rises and falls. It does not stay at the same height forever. But when you fight it, when you try to push it down, it seems to linger. Not because it is stronger, but because it is being held. When you allow it, without reacting, the body begins to release it naturally. The breath slows, the tension softens, the feeling changes. Not because you forced it to, but because you stopped interfering. There is a kind of courage in this. The willingness to sit with discomfort without needing to escape. To trust that you can feel something fully, without being overwhelmed by it. And in that trust, something settles deeply. You begin to see that anxiety is not the enemy.
The reaction to it was.
Once the reaction fades, the anxiety loses its power. It becomes just another sensation, another experience that comes and goes.
You are no longer caught in it.
You are simply aware of it. And from that awareness, the mind begins to rest, because it no longer needs to constantly protect you from discomfort.
It no longer needs to build thoughts to escape feelings.
It begins to trust stillness, to trust that you can remain where you are, even when something uncomfortable appears. And as this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose its final grip. Because there is nothing left to avoid, nothing left to control.
Nothing left to escape.
You are simply here, feeling without reacting, observing without resisting. And in that quiet presence, something deeper takes hold. A calm that is not dependent on the absence of anxiety, but on your ability to remain steady within it. And from that place, the mind finally begins to rest in a way it has not known before, not free from feeling, but free from the need to run from it. And as you begin to sit with discomfort without trying to escape it, something else becomes clearer. Not just how the mind reacts, but how much it carries. The constant build-up of thoughts, ideas, fragments, all competing for your attention at the same time. There is a quiet clutter inside the mind, not always loud, but always present. A mix of unfinished thoughts, small concerns, random memories, imagined scenarios. None of them urgent, but all of them taking up space. And because they are all given attention, even in small ways, the mind begins to feel crowded. Not overwhelmed by one thing, but by everything. This is where overthinking becomes heavy. Not because of a single thought, but because of too many being held at once. The mind has been trained to keep everything active, to remember, to revisit, to keep multiple things running in the background, as if holding on to more somehow makes you more prepared. But it does the opposite. It divides your attention. It spreads your focus thin. It creates noise, not clarity. There is a different approach, a quieter one. The practice of mental minimalism. Not removing thoughts, but reducing what you choose to engage with. When a thought appears, instead of automatically giving it space, pause. Ask yourself silently, does this need my attention right now?
Most of the time, it does not.
And in that moment, you have a choice, to keep it or to let it pass. Mental minimalism is not about controlling the mind. It is about simplifying your attention. You do not need to follow every thought. You do not need to carry every idea. You do not need to keep everything active at once. You can allow most things to fade naturally. At first, this may feel like you are letting go of something important. The mind is used to holding on to details, to keeping things available, to staying mentally prepared. But what you begin to notice is that most of what you were holding was not necessary. It was just there, taking up space. When you stop giving attention to everything, something shifts. The mind becomes clearer. Not because there are no thoughts, but because there are fewer being carried at the same time. You begin to experience thoughts one at a time. They come and they go,
Without overlapping, without building into something larger.
There is more space between them, and in that space, something calm begins to grow. You are no longer managing a crowded mind. You are allowing a simple one. A mind that is not filled with constant background noise. A mind that is not trying to hold everything at once, just present with what is here. There is also a sense of ease that comes with this. You are no longer trying to keep track of everything, no longer revisiting small details, no longer holding on to thoughts that do not need to stay. You begin to trust that what truly matters will return when it is needed.
And what does not can be released.
This trust allows the mind to relax, to stop holding so tightly, to stop carrying unnecessary weight. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to fade even further. Because overthinking depends on clutter, on multiple thoughts being active at once, on constant engagement. Once that clutter is reduced, the mind has less to work with, less to build, less to repeat. And what remains is simplicity. A clear, open space where attention is not scattered, where thoughts are not competing, where everything feels lighter. You are no longer trying to manage everything in your head.
You are simply allowing what is needed and letting go of what is not.
And in that simplicity, the mind finds something it has been missing. Not more control, not more clarity, but less. Less noise, less weight, less movement. And from that less, something deeper appears. A quiet stillness, a calm that is not forced, but natural. A mind that rests, because it is no longer carrying more than it needs. And in that rest, you begin to feel what true mental space is. Not empty, but free. And as the mind becomes lighter, carrying less and needing less, another quiet freedom begins to appear. One that feels small at first, but changes everything. The ability to leave things unfinished, without discomfort. There is a subtle tension that comes with incomplete thoughts. A sense that something has been left open. A quiet pull to return and finish what was started. And because of that pull, the mind keeps going back, picking up the same thought, trying to complete it, trying to reach some kind of end, as if peace depends on everything being fully resolved. But most thoughts do not need to be completed. They were never meant to reach a final point. They begin, and they can simply stop. The discomfort comes not from the incompleteness itself, but from the belief that it should not exist, that something must be finished before it can be left alone. But what if that is not true? There is a calm that begins to appear when you allow a thought to remain unfinished, when you stop following it to its end, when you release the need to close every loop in your mind. At first, this may feel unfamiliar. The mind is used to continuation. It wants to finish what it starts.
It wants to complete the pattern.
So when you stop midway, it may try to bring the thought back again. It may create a sense of tension, as if something is being left undone.
But if you remain still, that tension begins to soften.
Because nothing is actually missing. The thought does not need an ending to be released. It only needs to be allowed to stop. There is a quiet difference between something being unfinished and something being unresolved. Unfinished thoughts can exist without creating problems. They only become heavy when you try to carry them to completion. When you begin to allow incompleteness, something shifts.
The mind stops returning to the same places. The loops begin to break.
Because there is no longer a need to continue them. You may notice thoughts that start and then fade halfway, without being extended, without being completed.
And instead of feeling tension, there is ease.
A sense that it is okay for things to remain open, that not everything needs a conclusion. This is where the mind begins to rest more deeply.
Because it is no longer trying to finish everything.
It is no longer holding on to thoughts just to complete them. It is simply allowing them to pass, at any point. There is also a quiet release in this. You are no longer tied to every thought you begin. You are no longer committed to following it wherever it leads. You can step away at any moment, and nothing is lost.
In fact, what is lost is the weight,
the pressure, the constant movement.
As this becomes more natural, the mind begins to feel more open,
less crowded with unfinished loops, less pulled back into the same patterns, more free to remain still.
You begin to see that clarity does not come from finishing every thought.
It comes from not getting lost in them, from allowing them to remain incomplete, without needing to resolve them.
And in that allowance, something quiet takes hold.
A calm that is not dependent on completion, a stillness that is not disturbed by open loops, a mind that is no longer trying to tie everything together, just present,
just at ease.
And as you continue, this becomes your natural way of being. Thoughts begin, and they end whenever they end, not because you forced them to stop, but because you did not force them to continue. You are no longer chasing endings. You are simply allowing beginnings to pass.
And in that simple shift, the mind finds a deeper kind of rest.
One that does not depend on finishing everything, but on needing less in the first place. And as the mind becomes more comfortable leaving thoughts unfinished, another quiet habit begins to soften. One that has been shaping your thinking for a long time, the need for everything to make perfect sense. There is a subtle pressure to understand things clearly, to have the right interpretation, the right conclusion, the right way of seeing what happened. And when that clarity is not there, the mind keeps working.
It adjusts.
It refines. It searches for a version that feels complete, but that version rarely comes, because the mind is not just looking for understanding, it is looking for perfect understanding. And perfection in thought is something that does not exist. There are too many angles, too many unknowns, too many details that cannot be fully seen.
And yet, the mind continues to try.
This is where mental perfectionism quietly builds.
The belief that if you think long enough, deeply enough, carefully enough, you will arrive at a clear and final answer.
But most of the time, the more you think, the less clear things become. Because you are not moving toward clarity, you are chasing perfection. And perfection keeps shifting. Every time you get close, another question appears, another angle, another possibility that makes the answer feel incomplete again. So the mind continues, trying to refine what cannot be fully refined, trying to perfect what was never meant to be perfect. There is a different way to approach this. A quieter one, the willingness to accept that your understanding can be incomplete and still be enough. When a thought arises and the mind begins to search for the perfect explanation, pause.
Notice the movement.
The way it tries to organize everything into something clear and final. Instead of following that movement, allow the understanding to remain as it is, even if it feels partial.
Even if it feels unfinished.
You do not need to complete it. You do not need to make it perfect.
You can let it be exactly where it is.
At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to clarity. It wants things to make sense. It wants to arrive somewhere solid. So when you allow things to remain imperfect, it may feel like something is missing, but nothing is missing. What you are releasing is the need for everything to be fully understood.
And in that release, something changes.
The pressure begins to fade. The constant refining stops. The mind becomes less busy.
You begin to see that clarity is not always something you create through thinking.
Sometimes it is something that appears when thinking stops.
There is a quiet peace in accepting that you do not need to understand everything completely,
that some things can remain unclear without disturbing your calm. That life does not need to be fully explained in your mind for you to be at ease. This acceptance brings a different kind of clarity, not sharp, not perfect, but gentle, enough to move forward without tension, enough to rest without needing more. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose another layer of its hold.
Because overthinking depends on the belief that something must be perfected.
Once that belief fades, the mind no longer feels the need to keep refining. It begins to settle. You may notice thoughts that remain incomplete. And yet, there is no discomfort.
Understanding that is partial. And yet, it feels enough.
Moments where the mind is quiet. Not because everything is solved, but because nothing needs to be. And in those moments, something deeper takes hold.
A calm that does not depend on perfect clarity.
A stillness that is not disturbed by uncertainty. A mind that is no longer chasing the perfect answer, but resting in what is already present.
You are no longer trying to make everything complete.
You are allowing things to remain as they are. And in that allowance, the mind finds a deeper kind of ease. Not in knowing everything, but in needing less to feel at peace. And as the need for perfect understanding begins to fade, something even more practical starts to take shape. A quiet ability that changes how you move through your own mind, not just letting thoughts pass, but deciding which ones deserve your attention at all. Because not every thought is equal. Some are useful, some are necessary, but many are simply irrelevant. Small fragments, random ideas, old echoes, passing noise that has no connection to what is actually happening. And yet, without noticing, the mind treats them all the same. It gives them attention. It follows them. It allows them to grow. And slowly, the mind becomes filled with things that never needed to stay. This is where overthinking gains its volume, not from important thoughts, but from too many unimportant ones being taken seriously. There is a quiet discipline in learning to ignore, not forcefully, not with resistance, but with clarity. When a thought appears, instead of immediately following it, pause, notice what it is. Does it relate to what is happening right now? Does it require action?
Does it bring something useful?
Most of the time, the answer is no. And in that moment, you have a choice: to engage or to ignore. Ignoring does not mean pushing the thought away. It means not giving it your attention, not feeding it, not allowing it to grow. You simply let it pass, without involvement. At first, this may feel difficult. The mind is used to reacting to everything. It may try to pull you in, to make the thought feel important, to create a reason for you to follow it. But if you remain steady, if you do not engage, something begins to change. The thought fades quickly. It does not stay. It does not build. It disappears. Because it was never given the attention it needed to continue. There is a quiet power in this.
The ability to choose what deserves your focus and what does not.
You begin to see that your attention is not something that must be given to everything. It is something you can direct, something you can protect. And once you begin to protect it, the mind becomes clearer, less crowded, less noisy, more focused on what actually matters. You are no longer pulled in every direction by random thoughts. You are steady, present, aware of what is worth your energy and what is not. There is also a sense of control here, but it feels different, not forced, not rigid, just a calm awareness of where your attention is going, and a quiet decision to not follow what is unnecessary. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to fade even further, because overthinking depends on engagement, on every thought being followed, on every idea being explored. Once you begin to ignore what is irrelevant, the mind has less to work with, less to build, less to repeat. And what remains is simplicity, clear thoughts, focused attention. A quiet space where only what matters is allowed to stay. You begin to move through your mind with more ease, less distraction, less noise, more clarity. And in that clarity, something settles deeply. A calm that comes from not being overwhelmed by everything. A stillness that comes from choosing less. A mind that is no longer filled with unnecessary movement, but grounded in what truly deserves your attention. And from that place, rest becomes natural, because you are no longer carrying what was never meant to matter. And as your attention becomes more selective, something else begins to stand out more clearly. Not just the thoughts you ignore, but the ones that try to pull you in quickly, the ones that carry a sudden emotional charge. There are moments when a thought appears and it feels different, stronger, sharper. It carries a reaction with it. a feeling that rises almost instantly, before you even have time to notice what the thought was. A slight irritation, a flash of discomfort, a quick tightening inside. And before you realize it, the mind begins to follow. One thought leads to another. The emotion grows, the story builds, and something small becomes something much larger. This is how emotional triggers work. They are not powerful on their own. They become powerful when they are followed. The first moment is brief, just a spark. But if the mind continues, that spark turns into a chain reaction. Thought, reaction, more thought, stronger reaction. And suddenly, you are no longer observing.
You are inside it.
This is where overthinking often begins, not from a long process, but from a single moment that was followed too quickly. There is a different way to meet this, one that happens at the very beginning, when the trigger first appears, when the feeling rises, before the story builds. In that moment, pause. Do not follow the next thought. Do not continue the reaction. Just notice the feeling as it is. You may feel a slight tension, a quick shift in your body, something subtle but clear. Stay there. Do not turn it into a story. Do not add meaning to it. Just allow the sensation to exist, without movement.
At first, this may feel difficult. The mind is used to continuing.
It wants to explain the feeling, to justify it, to follow it into a full thought. But if you remain still, if you do not take that next step, something changes. The chain reaction stops. The feeling does not grow. It stays small, and then it fades, because it was never fed. There is a quiet power in catching the trigger early, before it builds, before it expands.
Before it becomes something larger than it needs to be.
You begin to see that most emotional reactions are not created by the first moment, but by what follows it.
And once you stop following, the reaction loses its strength.
You are no longer carried by it. You are simply aware of it. This awareness creates space, space between the trigger and the response. And in that space you are free. Free to not continue. Free to not react.
Free to let the moment pass, without turning it into something more.
As this becomes more natural, the mind begins to feel steadier, less reactive, less pulled by sudden emotions, more grounded, more calm. You may notice that situations that once led to long chains of thinking now pass quickly. A thought appears, a feeling rises, and then it fades, without building, without repeating, without staying. This is where a deeper calm begins to form, not because triggers no longer exist, but because they no longer control the direction of your mind. You are no longer following every emotional signal. You are simply noticing and allowing it to pass. And in that allowing, something settles. A quiet stability, a sense that you are no longer at the mercy of quick reactions, that you can remain steady, even when something tries to pull you. And from that steadiness, the mind begins to rest more deeply, because it is no longer caught in constant chains of reaction. It is free, free to remain still, even in the presence of emotion. And that stillness becomes your strength. And as the mind becomes less reactive, less pulled by sudden emotions, something important begins to unfold as night approaches. A quieter opportunity, a moment where everything slows, and the way you meet your own mind determines how deeply you rest. There is a subtle shift that happens before sleep. The body begins to relax. The world becomes still. But the mind, if left unchecked, may begin to move again, not loudly, but quietly. Thoughts drifting in, small ideas, fragments of the day. Nothing urgent, but enough to keep you slightly awake. This is where many people try to force sleep. They try to stop thinking, to push thoughts away, to make the mind quiet. But the more they try, the more the mind resists, because force creates tension, and tension keeps you awake. There is a different way to enter rest, not through control, but through quiet awareness. Instead of trying to stop the mind, you simply observe it. As you lie down, notice what is happening.
The feeling of your body against the surface.
The rhythm of your breath. The gentle rise and fall without needing to change it. Let your attention rest there. Not tightly, not with effort. Just gently noticing. Thoughts may still appear, small ones. Light ones. Let them come. But do not follow them. Do not push them away either. Just observe, like watching something pass in the distance. There is no need to engage, no need to react, no need to complete anything. You are simply here, aware. At first, the mind may still try to move. It may bring in a thought, then another. It may try to pull your attention away from the present, but each time gently return. Not by force, not by frustration, just by noticing again. The breath, the body, the quiet space around you. There is a softness in this, a way of being that does not try to control the mind, but allows it to settle on its own. And when you do not interfere, something begins to happen naturally. The thoughts become slower, less connected, less frequent. Not because you stop them, but because you stopped feeding them. The mind begins to unwind, like a thread slowly loosening. There is also a deeper calm that begins to form, not from silence, but from your relationship with what is present. You are no longer trying to fix the mind before sleep. You are simply observing it, allowing it to be exactly as it is, without resistance. And in that allowance, the body begins to let go more deeply. The breath becomes softer. The tension fades. The awareness becomes lighter. There is less effort, less movement, more stillness. You may notice moments where the thoughts stop for a while, not because you made them stop, but because there is nothing pushing them forward. And in those moments, the body drifts closer to rest, naturally, without effort, without force. This is where sleep begins to arrive, not as something you chase, but as something you allow.
You are no longer trying to enter sleep.
You are simply resting in awareness, and sleep comes to you. As this becomes a habit, nights begin to change. There is less struggle, less effort, less frustration with the mind. You no longer feel the need to silence everything before resting. You trust the process. You trust that observation is enough. That stillness will come on its own. And with that trust, the mind begins to settle more quickly, more gently. You move from thinking to observing, from reacting to allowing, from forcing to resting. And in that quiet shift, something deep takes place. The body relaxes, the mind softens, and sleep arrives. Not as a result of effort, but as a natural extension of stillness. You are no longer fighting your way into rest. You are simply allowing yourself to fall into it, through quiet awareness, through gentle presence, through letting go, without trying. And in that space, the mind finally finds the kind of rest it has been searching for all along. And as you begin to enter rest through quiet awareness, something else gently loosens its hold, a deeper pressure that has been running beneath everything, the need to understand, to make sense of every experience, to know why things happened the way they did.
There is a subtle tension in not knowing.
A quiet discomfort when something feels unclear, when a situation does not fully make sense, when an answer is missing. And almost instantly the mind begins to search. It looks for meaning. It connects details. It tries to create a clear picture, as if understanding everything is the only way to feel at ease. But life does not always offer that. There are moments that remain incomplete, conversations that never fully explain themselves, situations that end without clarity. And the more you try to understand them, the more the mind becomes restless, because it is trying to solve something that may not have a clear answer. This is where the pressure builds, not from the unknown itself, but from the need to remove it, the belief that peace comes only when everything is understood.
But what if that belief is what keeps the mind unsettled?
There is a different way to meet the unknown, one that does not involve constant searching. When something feels unclear, instead of trying to resolve it immediately, pause.
Let it remain as it is.
You do not need to fill in every gap. You do not need to create a full explanation. You can allow things to be partially unknown. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to certainty. It wants closure. It wants to feel like it has arrived at an answer. So when you leave something open, it may try to return to it again, to complete it, to understand it more deeply. But if you remain still, if you do not follow that movement, something begins to change. The pressure softens, the need to understand weakens, and the unknown becomes less threatening. You begin to see that not knowing does not create harm. It only feels uncomfortable because the mind is used to control. But when you release that need, the discomfort fades. There is a quiet peace in allowing life to remain partially unclear.
In accepting that not everything needs to be explained for you to move forward.
That not every experience needs to be fully understood for you to rest. You begin to carry less questions, less mental searching, less effort to make everything make sense. And in that release, something opens, a space where the mind is not constantly trying to complete everything,
a space where uncertainty is not a problem, but simply a part of life.
This is where calm deepens, not because everything is clear, but because nothing needs to be. You may notice that thoughts about the unknown still appear. Questions may arise, but they do not carry the same weight. They are lighter, less urgent, easier to let pass, because you are no longer trying to answer them immediately. You are allowing them to exist without needing to resolve them.
This creates a different kind of stability.
One that does not depend on certainty. One that remains steady even when things are unclear. You begin to trust that life does not need to be fully understood for you to be at peace within it. That clarity will come when it comes, and until then, you can rest. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to lose another layer of its hold, because overthinking depends on the need to understand everything. Once that need fades, the mind no longer searches endlessly.
It settles.
You are no longer trying to figure out every detail. You are simply allowing life to unfold without forcing it into a clear shape. And in that allowance, something settles deeply. A quiet acceptance, a gentle ease, a mind that is no longer pressured to understand everything, but free to rest in what is, even when it is incomplete, even when it is unknown. And from that place, true calm begins to live, not in certainty, but in the freedom of not needing it. And as the pressure to understand everything begins to dissolve, another layer quietly comes into view. Not the content of your thoughts, but the intensity behind them. The way some thoughts arrive with force, with emotion, with a feeling that makes them seem more real than others. There is a certain weight that comes with strong thoughts. They feel urgent, convincing, important.
as if their intensity proves their truth.
And because of that, they pull you in more quickly. A simple idea, when charged with emotion, becomes something you believe without question, not because it is accurate, but because it feels strong. This is where the mind becomes misled. It confuses intensity with truth. But intensity is not a measure of accuracy. It is a measure of energy. A thought can feel powerful and still be untrue. A thought can feel urgent and still be unnecessary. A thought can feel overwhelming and still be just a passing movement in the mind. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You no longer treat every strong thought as something that must be followed. You begin to observe it differently. When a thought appears with intensity, pause. Notice the feeling it carries, the way it tries to pull your attention, the way it creates a sense of urgency or importance. Instead of stepping into it, step back. See it as it is, a thought with energy, not a fact, not a command, just a thought. At first, this may feel difficult. Strong thoughts are designed to capture attention. They feel real. They feel immediate. They feel like something that must be handled. But if you stay with awareness, if you do not follow the intensity, something begins to happen. The energy starts to settle. The feeling softens, and the thought becomes clearer. You begin to see that what made it feel important was not its truth, but its intensity. And once that intensity fades, the thought loses its grip. There is a quiet distance that forms here, a space between you and the thought. You are no longer inside it. You are observing it.
And in that observation, you are free.
Free to not believe everything you feel. Free to not follow every strong impulse. Free to remain steady, even when the mind presents something intense.
This does not mean you ignore all strong thoughts.
It means you no longer trust intensity alone as a signal of truth.
You begin to look more carefully.
To see thoughts for what they are, not how they feel. And this changes everything. Because many of the thoughts that once controlled your attention begin to lose their influence. They still appear. They may still carry energy, but they no longer pull you in the same way. You remain grounded, aware, unmoved by the strength of the thought. There is a deeper calm in this, a sense that you are no longer at the mercy of emotional intensity.
That you can experience strong thoughts without being carried by them.
That you can feel something deeply, without needing to act on it or believe it completely.
As this becomes more natural, the mind begins to settle further.
The waves of intensity become easier to observe, less overwhelming, less controlling. You begin to trust your awareness more than the strength of the thought. And in that trust, something stabilizes, a quiet clarity, a steady presence. A mind that is no longer shaken by how strong a thought feels, but grounded in the understanding that not everything intense is true. And from that place the mind begins to rest more deeply, not trying to fight intensity, not trying to escape it, but simply seeing it and allowing it to pass, without being carried away, without losing yourself in it, just aware, calm, and steady. And as the mind learns not to trust intensity alone, another pattern begins to soften, one that often feels justified, even necessary. The habit of going back, revisiting what has already happened, turning over the same moments again and again as if something new might be found. There is a quiet pull toward the past. A memory appears, and the mind leans into it. It replays the scene. It examines the details. It looks for what could have been done differently. And at first, it feels like reflection, like learning. like understanding. But over time, something changes. The same moment returns, without anything new being discovered. The same thoughts repeat, without leading anywhere. And what once felt like reflection begins to feel heavy. This is where it shifts into something else. Not reflection, but repetition. Not understanding, but self-punishment. Because the mind is no longer learning from the past. It is reliving it. There is a subtle belief behind this habit, that if you revisit the moment enough times, you will fix it. That you will arrive at a version that feels right. That you will somehow change what has already happened. But the past does not change. And the more you return to it, the more you carry it. Each replay strengthens the emotional imprint. Each revisit deepens the feeling. Not because the event is happening again, but because the mind is keeping it alive. This is why it becomes painful, not from the moment itself, but from the repetition of it. There is a quiet release that begins when you see this clearly. The moment a memory appears, notice the pull to go deeper, the urge to replay it, to analyze it, to correct it in your mind. Instead of following that urge, pause.
Let the memory be there, without entering it.
You do not need to step inside it again.
You have already lived it once. There is nothing more to gain from reliving it repeatedly. At first, this may feel difficult. The mind is used to returning. It may bring the same memory again, trying to pull you in. But each time you choose not to engage, something begins to change. The memory becomes lighter, less detailed, less emotional.
Because it is no longer being reinforced.
There is a difference between remembering and revisiting. Remembering is brief, it passes. Revisiting is prolonged. It keeps the moment active. When you stop revisiting, the memory begins to settle into the past where it belongs. You are no longer carrying it into the present. There is also a deeper understanding that grows here. Not everything in the past needs to be corrected in your mind. Not every moment needs to be re-examined. Some things are complete, even if they were imperfect, and allowing them to remain as they are is what brings peace. You begin to trust that you can move forward without constantly looking back, that you do not need to carry every detail to learn from it. That growth does not come from repeated self-criticism, but from quiet acceptance. As this becomes more natural, the mind begins to feel lighter, less tied to what has already happened, less occupied with what cannot be changed, more present, more at ease. You may still remember, memories may still appear,
But they no longer pull you in.
they pass through without keeping you there. This is where a deeper calm begins to form, not from forgetting the past, but from no longer reliving it. You are no longer using thought as a way to punish yourself. You are allowing the past to remain where it is, and in that allowance, something settles. A quiet forgiveness, a gentle release, a mind that is no longer trapped in what has already happened, but free to rest in what is here now. And from that place, overthinking loses another layer of its hold, because there is no longer a need to return, only a quiet readiness to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. And as the mind begins to loosen its grip on the past, something quieter starts to take root, a slower rhythm, a different way of being with your thoughts, one that does not rush, does not force, and does not interfere. There is a subtle impatience that often goes unnoticed. The moment a thought appears, especially one that feels uncomfortable, there is a desire for it to go away, to disappear quickly, to be replaced with something lighter, something easier. And so the mind begins to act. It tries to push it out, to distract, to fix, to move on as fast as possible. But that movement creates tension. because the mind is no longer allowing the thought to pass. It is trying to make it pass, and that effort keeps it present. This is where patience becomes strength. Not patience in waiting for something outside of you, but patience within your own mind, the ability to let a thought exist for as long as it needs, without trying to shorten it or extend it. There is a natural timing to everything that arises, thoughts included. They come, they stay for a moment, and they fade. But when you interfere with that timing, when you try to rush it or control it, you disrupt the process. The thought lingers, not because it wants to, but because it is being resisted. Mental patience is the quiet decision to stop interfering. When a thought appears, instead of trying to remove it, stay. Let it be there. Do not push it away. Do not follow it either. Just allow it to exist as it is. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The mind is used to action, to doing something about what it experiences. So when you remain still, it may feel like nothing is happening. But something is happening. The thought is moving on its own. Without your involvement, without your effort, it begins to soften, to lose its shape, to fade. And you are simply there, observing. There is a quiet trust that grows from this. The understanding that thoughts do not need to be managed constantly, that they know how to pass when you let them. You begin to feel less urgency, less need to control, less pressure to change what is happening inside your mind. There is more space, more stillness, more ease. You are no longer reacting to every thought. You are allowing it and trusting its natural movement. This patience changes the entire experience. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt persistent becomes temporary. What once felt urgent becomes distant, because you are no longer interfering. You are giving the mind the space it needs to settle itself. There is also a deeper calm in this, a sense that you do not need to rush your inner experience, that you can sit with whatever arises without needing it to end immediately. And in that sitting, something shifts. The thoughts begin to fade more quickly, not because you forced them to, but because you stopped holding on to them. You may notice moments where a thought appears, stays briefly, and then disappears without effort. Those moments are not accidental. They are the result of patience, of not interfering, of allowing the mind to move at its own pace. As this becomes more natural, overthinking begins to dissolve even further, because overthinking depends on impatience, on the need to fix, to resolve, to move quickly. Once that impatience fades, the entire pattern weakens. The mind becomes calmer, slower, more steady. You are no longer trying to control the timing of your thoughts. You are allowing them to come and go as they are meant to. And in that allowance, something settles deeply. A quiet confidence, a steady calm, a mind that trusts itself to rest without needing constant intervention. And from that trust, true stillness begins to grow, not forced, not created, but revealed through patience. And now, something inside you is quieter than it was before. Not because every thought disappeared, but because you no longer follow them the same way. You've seen how the mind moves, how it repeats, reacts, predicts, defends, and tries to control. And more importantly, you've learned that you don't have to go with it. You don't have to finish every thought. You don't have to solve every question. You don't have to believe every feeling. There is a space now between you and the noise, a space where thoughts can come and go without pulling you in, a space where uncertainty can exist without disturbing your peace, a space where your mind is no longer a battlefield, but a place you can finally rest. And the truth is simple. Overthinking was never your strength. Stillness is. Tonight, You're not trying to control your mind anymore. You're allowing it to settle. And as you continue this practice, slowly, gently, you'll begin to notice something powerful. The silence you were searching for was never far away. It was just hidden, behind your need to engage. If you felt even a small shift while listening to this, write in the comments, "I let it pass." That one sentence is more than a comment. It's a decision. And if you want more of this kind of calm, clarity, and control over your inner world, subscribe to the channel and stay with this journey. Because the more you return to this space, the less your mind controls you, and the more you begin to live quietly, clearly, and free.